They told her to disappear. So she did. But nobody told Destiny the same thing. This is the story of Celine Hart, a woman stripped of everything, cast into frozen wilderness, abandoned by the man whose soul was bound to hers. She had nothing but wounds and a secret she carried in her body like a burning coal. Watch until the end, because what comes next will break every expectation you have about power, survival, and what it costs a king to be wrong. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where my people are watching from tonight. Now, let's begin. The night they destroyed her, the sky was completely clear. No storm, no sign. Just cold stars hanging over Shadowcrest Citadel like witnesses who had already decided not to intervene. Celine Hart stood in the center of the grand tribunal hall with her hands loose at her sides and her spine straight, because she had decided somewhere between the antechamber and the threshold that she would not let them see her fold. The hall was enormous, black granite columns rising 40 feet on either side, polished to a mirror finish that threw the torchlight back in amber fragments. Every inch of it had been designed to make the person standing in its center feel small. The architects of Shadowcrest had understood something fundamental about power, that it was, at its most basic, the business of making other people feel like they occupied less space than they deserved. She refused to shrink. She was 22 years old. Her boots were worn at the left heel from the way she favored that side when she stood for long periods. Her healer's coat, plain charcoal wool, no insignia, no decoration, was pressed because she had pressed it herself at 3 in the morning, because she had not slept, because the summons had arrived at midnight, and she had spent the hours until dawn trying to prepare for something she fundamentally could not prepare for. You cannot prepare for the moment a person looks at you and decides you are worth less than the problem you represent. The court was already assembled when she entered. 300 nobles, generals, ministers of the royal cabinet. Lady Vivian Blackmore sat in the gallery directly to Celine's right, elevated on a cushioned platform with her attendants arranged behind her like decorative furniture. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful. All surface and architecture, nothing accidental. Her gown was deep violet silk. Her hair was black and arranged with the kind of deliberate perfection that required 2 hours and a dedicated staff. She looked at Celine the way a person looks at a door they are about to walk through. Not with contempt exactly, but with the flat efficiency of someone who has already assigned you to a category. Celine did not look at her for long. She was looking at Cassian. King Alpha. Cassian Thorne stood at the head of the hall on the raised judicial dais, and the first thing Celine registered, the thing she would remember in sharp, aching detail for years afterward, was that he looked exhausted. Not the exhaustion of a man who hadn't slept, the exhaustion of a man who had been fighting a battle inside himself for weeks and had finally, sometime in the last 24 hours, surrendered. He was 27, 6'4", built like the war he'd grown up in, with broad shoulders that had never quite lost the hunch they'd developed from years of bending over strategy maps. His jaw was too sharp. His eyes were the color of charcoal smudged with gray. Not beautiful eyes, not inviting eyes, but the kind of eyes that cataloged everything they touched and gave nothing back. He wore his crown like it was a weight class he'd trained into. He did not look at her when she entered. That was the first wound. The second was the silence. In a hall of 300 people, no one made a sound. Not because they were disciplined, because they were waiting. The way a crowd waits at an execution, not with cruelty necessarily, but with the particular focused appetite of people who have come to witness something irreversible. Lord Chancellor Drevon stepped forward. He was an old man with the build of a man who had been powerful once, and now wore the memory of it in the set of his shoulders. He unrolled a parchment with the deliberate theater of someone who knew everyone in the room was watching him. Celine Hart, he said. His voice filled the space easily. Born in the border province of Ashfin, licensed healer. No noble title, no registered bloodline. He paused. Let that last clause sit. You have been summoned before the Tribunal of the Crown to address the matter of the fated mate bond declared by His Majesty King Cassian Thorne during the Festival of Convergence 6 weeks ago. Celine's throat was dry. She swallowed once. I'm here, she said. 2 words. She kept them clean. Drevon looked up from the parchment. His Majesty has a statement. And then Cassian looked at her. She had been waiting for it, braced for it, and it still landed like a fist. Because for 1/2 second, one fraction of a moment that she would spend years trying to decide if she had imagined, something crossed his face that wasn't royal composure, Something raw and poorly contained, like a fire glimpsed through a keyhole. And then it was gone. And the king looked out at his court, and he began to speak. The bond declared at the Festival of Convergence was a biological response, Cassian said. His voice was controlled to a degree that required significant machinery beneath the surface. Not a contract, not a declaration of intent. The laws of this empire are clear. The selection of a royal mate is a matter of political stability, noble alliances, and the continuation of a dynasty that has protected this realm for 400 years. He paused. No single biological response overrides that responsibility. The court was absolutely still. Celine's hands were still loose at her sides. She made them stay that way. The mate bond, Cassian continued, is hereby formally renounced under the authority of the crown. Celine Hart will be granted safe passage beyond the northern border of the empire, with provision sufficient for 1 month's travel. Another pause. Lady Vivian Blackmore has agreed to be my queen. The formal engagement will be announced at the next court session. He had not looked at Celine once during the entire statement. Not once. The room exhaled. Not in relief exactly. In something more complicated. The collective release of a crowd that has witnessed something it doesn't entirely want to be comfortable with but is not prepared to challenge. Celine stood there for 5 full seconds. She was counting. She did not know why she was counting, except that it gave her something to do with the part of her mind that was trying to tear itself apart. Then she said quietly, "Is that it?" Dravon looked up. A few heads turned. It was not the response anyone had expected. "I beg your pardon," Drevin said. "I asked if that's it." She kept her voice even. Even was all she had. 300 people, the chancellor, the crown, that whole parchment. Is that the entire proceeding? The king has spoken. I heard what the king said. She turned her head and looked directly at Cassian. He was still facing the court, still not looking at her. "I'm asking if there's anything else. Whether anyone in this hall has a single thing to add that isn't about borders or bloodlines or the next 400 years of political stability." Silence. "Because I have something," Celine said. "Miss Hart." Drevin's voice had an edge in it now. "The proceeding is, I was born in Ashvin." She spoke over him, which was a transgression, and she knew it was a transgression, and she did not stop. "My mother was a midwife. My father fixed cartwheels. When I was 9 years old, there was a fever outbreak along the border, and 3 children on our street died in 8 days, and my mother sat with every one of them and held their mother's hands because that was what she knew how to do. I trained for 6 years. I have healed soldiers from this king's army who came back from the eastern campaigns with wounds that would have killed them in any other care. I have never asked this empire for anything." She paused. The hall was so quiet she could hear the torches. "I'm still not asking. I just want someone to stand in this room and say plainly what this is." She looked at Cassian. He was looking at her now. "This is a king choosing his kingdom over you," she said. Quiet. Direct. Not accusatory, just naming it. "I understand that, I do. But I want him to look at me when he does it. I think the person you're discarding is at least owed your eyes." The silence lasted a long time. Then Cassian said, "The proceeding is concluded." He turned and walked through the door behind the dais. He did not look at her again. She did not cry until she was outside the citadel walls. Not inside. Not in the antechamber, where 2 guards waited to escort her to the provisions office. Not in the corridor, not at the gates, not while she walked across the outer courtyard with her healer's coat still pressed and her boots still worn at the left heel. Outside. In the dark, with the cold biting at her face and her breath coming in white clouds and nobody watching, she stopped walking and put one hand against the outer wall of the citadel and bent forward at the waist and cried in the way that has nothing to do with sound, the kind that lives entirely in the body, that shakes the ribcage and pulls at the sternum and leaves a person feeling emptied. 3 minutes. She gave herself 3 minutes. Then she straightened, wiped her face with the back of her hand, breathed, and noticed something. She had not eaten in nearly 18 hours, and she was nauseous in a way that wasn't entirely explained by grief, and she was only a few days past the point where she'd expected something to happen that hadn't happened. And she was a healer, and healers recognize certain things with a particular and devastating precision. She stood against the wall of Shadowcrest Citadel in the dark and did the arithmetic and understood what it meant. She stood very still for a long moment. Then she picked up her bag, put one foot in front of the other, walked north. The provisions they gave her were adequate. A horse, elderly but sound, 2 saddlebags, dried meat, hardtack, a blanket, a water skin, basic medical supplies, a document with the crown seal that would permit her passage through the border checkpoints without delay. Whoever had organized it had been efficient about it, and Celine had the bitter thought that the empire was good at exile the way it was good at everything, with bureaucratic precision and no apparent recognition of the human material it was processing. The first night she camped in a hollow between 2 spruce trees, wrapped in the blanket with her back against the larger trunk and the horse tied nearby, and she did not sleep. She cataloged what she had. She was trained in survival medicine. She could identify edible plants in 4 climate zones. She spoke 2 languages besides her own. She had 12 gold coins sewn into the hem of her coat, a precaution she had taken years ago out of a border province instinct that had nothing to do with foresight and everything to do with the knowledge that things could go wrong without warning. She had survived before. She would survive this. What she turned over in her mind over and over wasn't survival. Survival was a problem with solutions. What she turned over was something harder. The question of how a person calibrates their trust in their own perception after an event that retroactively challenges everything they thought they knew. Because she had believed, with the absolute conviction of a person who is also feeling it in their blood, that what happened at the Festival of Convergence was real, that the recognition she felt when she looked at Cassian Thorne, that particular cellular certainty, like a key finding a lock, was not something she had invented. She still believed it. She understood now that the truth of a thing and the power of a thing are entirely separate questions. A bond can be real and still be overridden. A recognition can be genuine and still be rejected. The universe does not guarantee that the things it creates will be honored. It creates them and steps back and lets the creatures it made decide what they're worth. Cassian Thorne had decided, and here was what she would not do. She would not spend the rest of her life waiting for him to decide differently. She pressed her hand flat against her abdomen in the dark. "Okay," she said, to the trees, to the dark, to the small impossible fact of what she carried. "Okay, here's what we're going to do." It took her 11 days to reach the northern border. The checkpoint guards were bored, efficient, and slightly embarrassed by the document they had to process. The Crown's exile orders did not come through often, and the young woman who presented it looked nothing like the kind of person they had been trained to associate with political removal. They stamped her through without conversation, and she passed into the territory beyond the Empire's reach without looking back. She had promised herself she would not look back. She didn't. 3 months later, she crossed into the outer reaches of the Kingdom of Silverhaven. It was not famous then. It was a middle territory, prosperous enough, ruled by a governor with the good sense to stay out of the larger empire's politics. The people were frontier stock, practical, self-sufficient, deeply suspicious of strangers in the particular way of communities that had learned through repeated experience that strangers brought problems. Celine arrived in the town of Greywood with a horse who was more tired than she was, a coat that needed mending, and a body that was now unmistakably, visibly, insistently pregnant in a way that made conversations brief and accommodations slightly harder to negotiate. She found work in 3 days. Not because anyone was kind, because there was a sickness moving through the lower quarter of Greywood that the local herbalist was managing competently but slowly, and Celine walked into his dispensary, assessed the situation in about 20 minutes, and suggested 3 modifications to his treatment protocol that cut the recovery time in half. The herbalist, a wiry man in his 50s named Torrance, who wore his skepticism openly and usefully, looked at her for a long moment. "Where'd you train?" he asked. "The border provinces," she said, "and then Shadowcrest for 2 years." "Shadowcrest?" His eyebrows shifted. "You leave, or they ask you to." "They asked me to." A pause. "What'd you do?" "I existed in a category they didn't have a use for." Torrance looked at her for another moment, looked at the unmistakable architecture of her pregnancy, looked back at her face. "There's a room above the dispensary," he said. "Costs half what the boarding house charges. It's not warm. There's a draft through the east wall I've been meaning to fix for 6 years." "I can fix it," Celine said. "I know you can," Torrance said. "That's why I'm offering. Sing." She gave birth in the dispensary on a night in late winter. Torrance had delivered babies before. Not often, but enough. And he had sent for the midwife 3 hours in, and the midwife had arrived and taken one look at the situation and rolled up her sleeves without comment, which was the most practical kindness Celine had received since crossing the border. The first one came in the hour before midnight. She named him Orion. The second came 17 minutes later. She named him Lucian. The third, the smallest, the most ferociously determined of the three, who announced her arrival with a volume that made both the midwife and Torrance actually step back a half step, came just after midnight. She named her Lyra. Celine lay in the narrow bed above the dispensary with all three of them arranged along her body in the careful configuration the midwife had shown her, and she was wrung out, scraped hollow, exhausted beyond any exhaustion she had catalogued before, and her hands were shaking slightly, and she was crying again. The quiet kind. The body kind. The kind that doesn't require explanation. She looked at Orion's face, then Lucian's, then Lyra's. "Okay," she said. Same word she'd said in the dark against the citadel wall. Different weight to it now. "Okay." She did not say their father's name. She would not say their father's name. They were hers. Fully, entirely, irrevocably hers. What they carried in their blood was not their father's contribution. It was the raw material the universe had handed her to work with, and what she built with it would belong to no king, no empire, no court of 300 people waiting to watch something irreversible. That was the agreement she made with herself that night. She held to it for 5 years. The triplets grew the way exceptional things grow, conspicuously and in ways that kept surprising even the people watching closely. By the time they were 2, Torrance had stopped being remotely surprised and started being quietly and genuinely awed, which for a man of his practical disposition meant he expressed it entirely through action, fixing the east wall draft, building a proper crib, teaching Orion the names of herbs with the patient repetition of a man who has decided, without announcement, that certain small people are worth his serious attention. By the time they were 3, Celine had moved from the room above the dispensary into a small house at the edge of Greywood that she was renting with money she had earned, and she had a reputation that extended to the next 2 towns, and people came from a day's ride away to see her. By the time they were 4, the governor of Silverhaven had sent his second-in-command to ask if she would consider taking a formal position with the province's medical council, and she had said yes because it gave her stability and access and the ability to build something durable, and she understood by now that durability was the project. By the time they were 5, the kingdom of Silverhaven had changed in ways that its governor recognized were substantially connected to the woman who had arrived from the border with a worn heel boot and a practical mind, and 3 children who carried themselves with a quality that the governor's aide, a careful man, good at observation, described in his notes as authority in formation. Celine had built something real. It had cost her everything she'd started with. That was the part nobody who came to her for healing understood, because what they saw was a woman in command of her situation. They saw competence and warmth and the particular steadiness that comes from a person who has processed their worst thing and come through it. They didn't see the nights when one of the children had a nightmare, and she sat with them in the dark and felt the shape of everything she'd carried alone pressing down on her sternum with a weight that required specific, deliberate management. She managed it. She woke up every morning and managed it. Because that is what survival actually is, stripped of the myth. Not one great dramatic act of will, but 10,000 ordinary mornings where you get up and do the work because the work is there and the people who need you are real. A woman who has survived by her own structure does not confuse motion with strength. She knows the difference because she has felt both the frantic motion of grief trying to outrun itself and the quiet, ground-level strength of a person who has decided, in the most fundamental sense, to remain. Celine Hart was, by her 32nd year, entirely the second kind. Not harder, not closed. Just located, settled inside herself the way a deep-rooted tree is settled, capable of significant bending without the roots coming loose. She was, in the simplest terms, not the woman they had exiled. She was something the Empire had not anticipated. Check. The day the riders from Shadowcrest appeared on the northern road, Celine was in the province's central healing hall, finishing a 3-hour consultation with a family from the outer settlements whose youngest child had developed a bone condition that required a treatment protocol Celine had been designing from her own research. She heard about the riders from Torrance, who had developed over 5 years the particular skill of appearing at her elbow with relevant information in a tone that communicated the relevant information and let her decide the rest. 6 horsemen on the northern road, he said, coming through the hall's side door with his coat half-fastened and his expression careful. Imperial livery, Shadowcrest black, Celine's hands did not stop what they were doing, which was compressing a medicinal compound into a small clay vessel. She compressed it twice more. Set it down. Then she straightened and looked at Torrance. "How far out?" she said. "Marek's boy came in a fast ride, maybe an hour." She thought for a moment. Not long. Celine's processing was not theatrical. "Where are the children?" "School hall. Lyra's there until the second bell. Orion and Lucian have the afternoon with Instructor Venn. Send someone to get them." She kept her voice level. "Not urgently, quietly. Bring them to the house, not the hall." "You know who it is?" Torrance said. She looked at him. "Not specifically," she said, "but I know the Empire. And I know that Shadowcrest doesn't send riders to the north unless something in Shadowcrest is very wrong." The something that was very wrong was not a secret within the Empire. It had been building for 3 years, and the political dispatches that came through Silverhaven's trade routes told the story in pieces. No heir. No pregnancy. Lady Vivian Blackmore, Queen Vivian Thorne by title now, had produced no children in 5 years of marriage. The noble houses were restless. 3 of the border territories had tested their obligations to the crown with increasing boldness. The Eastern lords were maneuvering with the specific, predatory attentiveness of people who have identified a structural weakness and are deciding how long to wait before they press it. An empire without an heir is not actually an empire. It is a large and well-armed piece of contested property. Celine had followed these developments the way a navigator follows weather, not with personal investment, but with the professional attention of someone for whom accurate information is a survival tool. She knew what the Empire's crisis meant in the abstract. She had never allowed herself to follow that thread to its logical end, because the logical end connected to things she had excised from her daily life with significant surgical effort. But she had always known, in the part of herself that operated below the level of daily management, that the thread was there. The riders arrived in Greywood as the afternoon light began its western slant, turning the packed dirt of the main street to amber. She watched them from the upper window of the healing hall. There were 7, not 6. One additional rider in the rear guard who kept a slightly greater distance than the others, and whose posture had a particular quality that made her understand, before she could see his face, that he was not a guard. He was the thing the guards were guarding. She made herself stay at the window long enough to be certain. Then she walked downstairs, put on her coat, and went out into the street. The riders had pulled up at the center of the market square, which was the geographical fact of Greywood that announced authority best. Open ground, visible from all directions, a place where arriving with force meant something. The 6 guards were already on the ground, establishing perimeter in the practiced way of men who do this regularly. The 7th rider had dismounted and was standing with his back partially toward her, speaking to the lead guard. He was taller than she remembered. She had spent 5 years not remembering, and the fact that she was now noting this with clinical specificity told her exactly how well that project was going. She walked across the square with her healer's coat over plain dark wool and her hands at her sides and her spine straight, which was what she had done in the Grand Tribunal Hall 11 years ago and what she would apparently do for the rest of her life in situations that required it. The lead guard saw her first. His hand moved to his sword hilt, not drawing, just locating, and then the 7th rider turned. Cassian Thorne looked at her across 30 feet of amber afternoon light. He looked, she catalogued, with the involuntary precision of a person seeing something they have been not looking at for 5 years, exactly like what he was. A king who was winning most of his visible battles and losing the one that mattered. The crown's weight had settled into him differently. The hunch of the strategy map years was gone, replaced by a bearing that was pure exhausted authority. His face had shed whatever youth it had carried at 27. He was harder now, more angular, the charcoal eyes carrying a quality she recognized as a person who had gotten very good at deciding not to feel things, and was now living with the cumulative cost of that skill. He looked at her. She looked at him. 30 feet, amber light, 5 years of managed distance between them collapsing in real time. "Celine," he said. His voice was exactly the same. That was the specific cruelty of the moment, that her body recognized his voice with a precision that 5 years of disciplined living had done absolutely nothing to dull. "Your Majesty," she said. Clean, formal. The 2 words building a wall she intended to maintain. He crossed half the distance between them, stopped. His guard shifted fractionally behind him. "I'm not here officially," he said. You brought 6 armed guards, she said. That's official enough. The roads aren't safe. The roads in Silverhaven are some of the safest in the Northern Territories. I helped design the patrol schedule. She let that sit for a moment. Why are you here, Cassian? Not your majesty now. She hadn't planned to drop it. It happened anyway. Something moved in his face. There are things happening in the Empire, he said. Instability. He stopped, recalibrated, started again. I've been told that Silverhaven has become the most stable and prosperous territory in the Northern Reach in the last 3 years, that the governing model here is something the Empire's troubled territories might learn from. He paused. I came to negotiate an alliance, formally. Trade agreements, medical exchange, shared governance structures. That's the official reason, Celine said. He looked at her directly. Yes. And the unofficial reason. A beat. I wanted to see how you were, he said. The simple honesty of it landed harder than any formal proceeding. She kept her face even. I'm well, she said. Silverhaven has been good to me. I have work I believe in and people I trust. She looked at him steadily. You could have sent an envoy for the official reason. You didn't need to come yourself. No, he agreed. So this is about something else. He opened his mouth and then stopped, because his eyes had moved past her shoulder to the street behind her, and something in his face changed with a violence that was entirely contained but entirely visible to anyone paying attention. Celine turned. Torrance was coming across the square with the 3 of them, Orion, Lucian, and Lyra, released early from instruction, walking in their particular formation that was less a product of training and more a product of 5 years of being 3 people who were also, in some fundamental sense, one unit. Orion was in front, which was where Orion usually was. Not because anyone told him to lead, but because he oriented toward front without apparent thought. Lucian walked at his left shoulder, slightly quieter, the one who watched the space around them rather than the path ahead. Lyra was at Orion's right, already looking at the square, already processing, and this was the quality that made grown adults step back when they first encountered it. Already thinking 3 moves ahead. They were 5 years old. They looked exactly like what they were. Orion had Cassian's eyes. Lucian had Cassian's aura, that particular alpha weight that Celine had no other word for, the quality that made a room aware of a person before the person had done anything, that low-frequency broadcast of consequence. Lyra had Cassian's jaw and the sharp systematic intelligence of a line that had ruled an empire for 400 years. Celine watched Cassian look at them. She watched the recognition hit him. She had imagined this moment many times in the first year. Imagined it with anger, with grief, with the elaborate and ultimately exhausting scenarios that a wronged person constructs in the dark. She had stopped imagining it somewhere in year 2, when she'd realized the imagining was taking something from her that she needed for the actual work of living. But she had never been able to stop understanding that it was possible, that someday, in some form, this specific moment might occur. That the universe, which had demonstrated no particular interest in protecting her from difficulty, also operated without a clear mechanism for keeping parallel facts permanently separate. The 3 children crossed the square toward their mother. The most powerful Alpha King in the realm stood 7 feet away and went completely still. Orion reached Celine first. He put one hand on her arm, a 5-year-old's gesture, unconsciously checking that she was present and intact, and then turned his attention to the men in the square with the frank, assessing directness that made his mother's chest ache with recognition. He looked at Cassian. Children that age do not mask their recognition. Orion looked at Cassian Thorne the way you look at someone you have seen before in a different form, in a story, in a reflection, in the particular quality of your own face in still water. Mom, he said, in the clear, practical voice of a child who is processing new information. Who is that? The silence in the square had a quality that was distinct from ordinary silence. Celine did not look at Cassian. She looked at her son. She took one breath. That, she said carefully, is a guest who needs a place to stay tonight. She heard Cassian exhale behind her. She heard, and this was what hit her with a force she had not fully prepared for even knowing it was coming. She heard his exhale catch, break, reform. The sound a man makes when he encounters something so far outside the range of what he thought he was walking into that his body registers it before his mind does. She heard the king of Shadowcrest understand, standing in an amber afternoon in a provincial square, what 5 years of bad choices cost. She kept her eyes on her children. Come on, she said steadily. All of you, inside. She walked toward the house without looking back. Behind her, the sound of boots on packed dirt told her that Cassian was following. And behind that, behind the sound of everything this moment was about to become, there was another sound, the sound of a rider, coming fast from the southern road. One of Cassian's outriders, who had ridden ahead of the main party, now returning at a pace that meant only one thing. Urgent news. The kind that doesn't wait. The outrider pulled up hard in the center of the square, and his horse's breathing was ragged, and his face was white, and he looked at the king and then at the sealed document in his hand, and he said, with the particular toneless precision of a soldier delivering something he wishes he didn't have to deliver, Your Majesty, from Lord Chancellor Dravon, Shadowcrest Citadel is under assault. Lady Vivian has opened the gates. The outrider's horse was still blowing hard when Cassian crossed the square in 4 strides and took the sealed document from the man's hand. He broke the seal. Read. His face did not change. That was the thing about a king who had ruled through crisis for a decade. The face became a separate instrument, something maintained independently of the interior, like a mask that had been worn so long it had partly fused to the skin. Celine watched him from 6 feet away and read him anyway, because she had always been able to read him, because that particular skill had been the source of both her deepest connection to him and the most devastating moment of her life. And apparently 5 years had done nothing to dull it. His jaw tightened once. The charcoal eyes moved left, then right, processing. Then he folded the document with precise, deliberate movements and turned to his lead guard. Get the horses watered and rested, he said. We don't move until I say. The guard hesitated. Your Majesty, the Chancellor's instruction. I heard the Chancellor's instruction. Cassian's voice was flat, not loud. The particular quiet of a man who has not raised his voice in so long that he no longer needs to. The horses rest. I'll advise you when we move. The guard stepped back. Cassian turned to Celine. She looked at him steadily. Behind her, Torrance had gathered the 3 children with the practiced efficiency of a man who understood without being told that the next conversation was not one for small ears. He had a hand on Orion's shoulder and was already redirecting them toward the dispensary with a murmured comment about checking on the evening's herb preparations, a fiction Orion was clearly not entirely buying, but he went, because Orion was 5 years old and exceptionally perceptive, and also because he trusted Torrance, and that trust was the result of 5 years of Torrance being reliably present in ways that mattered. Lyra looked back once before she went through the dispensary door. She looked at Cassian. Then she looked at her mother. Then she went inside. Celine filed that look away for later. There was a great deal she was filing away for later. Inside, she said to Cassian. Not an invitation, a direction. The Healing Hall's back room served as her office and consultation space. A functional room, not a comfortable one. A work table covered in organized materials. 2 chairs that had seen better decades. A single window facing east that let in the last of the afternoon light. She closed the door behind them and moved to the work table and put the table between herself and Cassian, which was a deliberate choice, and they both understood it as one. Tell me what the document said, she said. He looked at her. That's not a small ask, he said. I'm aware. Tell me anyway. He was quiet for a moment. She recognized the quality of the silence. Not reluctance, but the particular pause of a man who is deciding how much honesty he can afford. Vivian has been in contact with the Blackmore Coalition for 6 months, he said. Lords Edron, Sutter, and Mace. Possibly 2 of the Eastern Border commanders. Dravon says they moved faster than anyone anticipated. They had inside information about my departure from the Citadel. Someone in my personal guard. They knew you left. They knew I left, where I was going, and approximately when I'd arrive. He paused. The assault on the Citadel gates began less than 12 hours after I rode north. Celine processed this. How many loyal forces remain inside the Citadel? He looked at her with something that was almost, not quite, but almost, surprise. As if he had not expected the first question to be tactical rather than personal. 3 full battalions, he said. Commander Heth is in the Citadel. He's good. He'll hold the interior. And Vivian has the outer gates. She has the outer gates and approximately 400 mercenaries the Blackmore family has apparently been funding for 2 years without my knowledge. He said the last 5 words with a controlled flatness that had a great deal of weight underneath it. Celine leaned her hands on the work table. And you're here, she said. I'm here. You rode north to negotiate an alliance with a frontier province while your marriage was financing a coup. The silence had a different quality now. I didn't know about the coup, Cassian said. No, you knew about the marriage, though. She looked at him directly. You knew what you chose. You knew what you built. And you still came north. Celine, I'm not attacking you. She said it cleanly because she wasn't. This was not grief talking. This was a woman who had spent 5 years developing the habit of naming things accurately. I'm asking you to be honest about what this is. Because the Empire's crisis is real, and I understand the stakes of it. But you didn't ride 11 days north to negotiate a trade agreement. He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. I didn't. Then say the actual thing. He crossed to the window, stood with his back partially to her, looking out at the amber evening, and she watched the set of his shoulders and recognized the posture of a man who was preparing to say something he had not said aloud before. And the preparation was costing him, and she felt a flicker of something she did not want to examine closely because it was adjacent to an emotion she had locked in a room 5 years ago, and she was not ready to open that room. I dreamed about you, he said, for 3 years. He said it to the window. It wasn't. I'm not saying it the way it sounds. I mean something more specific than that. I mean that I would wake up at 4 in the morning and there would be this knowing, this understanding that something fundamental was wrong. Not with the Empire, not with the throne, with me. He stopped. It took me a long time to understand what the knowing was about, and then it took me even longer to accept that understanding. Celine did not say anything. There is a particular kind of pain that has nothing to do with the present moment, that lives in the gap between what was and what was chosen, between the road taken and the road abandoned. A king who has everything discovers that everything was built on a subtraction, and the subtraction does not stop mattering just because the structure above it is impressive. Cassian Thorne had spent 5 years being exactly this kind of man, a man living on top of a foundational absence, competent enough and powerful enough to maintain the structure, but aware, in the part of himself that operated below power, that the foundation was wrong. You have children, he said to the window. Not a question. Celine was very still. I have children, she said. 3 of them. 3. He turned from the window. He looked at her with the face that was not the king's face, something underneath that, older and less managed. They have my eyes, he said. Orion does. The second boy, the way he held himself when he walked across that square. He stopped. His voice was not breaking. It was doing something more controlled and more difficult than breaking. It was maintaining shape around something that wanted to collapse it. How old? 5, Celine said. He did the arithmetic. She watched him do it. Watched the result land. You knew, he said, when they exiled you. I suspected. I knew for certain 3 days north of the border. And you didn't. He stopped. Send word? She looked at him steadily. To who, Cassian? To the king who had just formally renounced our bond in front of his entire court and announced his engagement to another woman. With what message? My mistake? I'm carrying the heirs you just publicly decided you didn't need? She paused. What exactly did you imagine I would say? I don't know. His voice was low. I don't know what I imagined. I don't know what I would have done. I do, she said. Not cruel, just accurate. You would have done what was politically necessary, because that's what you were doing. That's what the whole proceeding was, political necessity. I understood that then. I still understand it, but understanding the reason for a wound doesn't close the wound. He crossed the room. He came around the side of the work table and stopped 4 feet away, and she held her ground because she was not the woman who had stood in that tribunal hall anymore, and she needed him to understand that in her bones and not just in her words. I made the wrong choice, he said. Yes. I knew it was the wrong choice when I made it. That landed differently. She looked at him. Then why? Because I was 27 years old, and I was standing in a room full of men who had been building the argument for political necessity for 6 months, and the argument was not wrong on its own terms, and He stopped. His jaw worked. I was afraid. The word cost him something significant. She could see the cost of it in the way he held himself after saying it. Not ashamed exactly, but stripped of something. The way a man looks when he has put down armor he has worn for so long he had forgotten it was armor. Afraid of what? She said. Of choosing something for myself. He said it like a man identifying a disease he has been living with. My entire life was built on doing what the Empire required. My father built that in me. The court built that in me. Every decision I made from the time I was 12 years old was filtered through what the Empire needed from me, what the bloodline required, what the 400 years of this dynasty demanded. And then the bond happened, and it was the first thing in my life that was entirely mine, that had nothing to do with what was required, and he exhaled. I didn't know what to do with something that was only mine. Celine stood on the other side of that silence for a long moment. Here was the truth that she had worked very hard not to let herself see, because seeing it made the grief more complicated. And complicated grief is harder to live with than clean grief. He was not a monster. He had never been a monster. He was a man who had been built by a system that treated personal truth as a liability, and when the moment came that required him to choose between the system's logic and his own, he had chosen the system, and the choosing had cost them both everything. And the cost had not made the choice right, but it had made it comprehensible in a way that clean anger could not hold. Understanding the architecture of someone's failure does not obligate you to absorb its consequences. She had learned that in year 2, and she held it now like a tool. Cassian, she said, your children are in the next building. Your empire is being held by a woman you married for political necessity who has apparently decided that if she can't secure the succession, she will burn the entire structure down. She paused. What do you need right now? He blinked. Something shifted in his face. I need to get back to Shadowcrest, he said. I need my guard fully rested and resupplied. He stopped. What? He looked at her with the full weight of everything this moment contained and said the thing he had not planned to say. The thing that had ridden 11 days north with him beneath every official reason he had constructed. I need you to not disappear again. When this is over, I need to know where you are. The silence held. You don't get to need that yet, Celine said. You don't get to need that the same day you ride into my life with your empire on fire and my children 3 feet away from you. That's a conversation that requires more than one evening. I know. But you're asking anyway. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she crossed to the door and opened it. Your men can use the outer barn. Torrance will see to the horses. She looked back at him once. And Cassian, whatever you're feeling right now, whatever this evening is doing to you internally, you handle that yourself tonight. Because tomorrow you ride south and you do what a king has to do, and right now there are 3 children in the next building who still don't know who you are. And that particular conversation happens on my terms and my timeline, not yours. She walked out. But, She found the 3 of them in Torrance's back room, which was the warmest corner of the dispensary and which had accumulated over 5 years a collection of small objects, smooth stones, a carved wooden figure, a stack of well-handled reference texts that constituted the physical record of her children's curiosity. Orion was sitting on the workbench with his arms crossed, which meant he was thinking hard about something and using his body to keep the thinking contained. Lucian was at the work table, turning a dried herb bundle over in his hands with the absent focus of a child who processes the world through touch. Lyra was standing at the window, looking in the direction of the healing hall. Who is he? Lyra said. Not a question the way 5-year-olds usually ask questions. Something with more architecture. Celine sat down on the stool near the work table and looked at all 3 of them. He's someone from a long time ago, she said. Before us, Orion said. Before you, yes. And from the same time as you. She kept her voice even. He's from the Empire to the south. He's the king there. Lucian looked up from the herb bundle. Kings are trouble, he said, with the flat certainty of a child who has absorbed this from 5 years of his mother's carefully neutral descriptions of the political landscape. Selene felt the specific kind of laughter that lives just below grief. She managed it. Sometimes, she said. Why is he here? Lyra said. She was still at the window. Because his empire has a problem he needs help with. What kind of problem? The kind that threatens a lot of people. Selene paused. His queen has tried to take his throne. He needs to go back and stop it. Orion uncrossed his arms. Then why is he still here? Because his horses need rest. Orion processed this with the expression of a child who understands this is the surface-level answer. Okay, he said finally, in the tone of a person who is cataloging information for later review. Okay. Lyra turned from the window. She looked at Celine with her sharp, systematic gaze. The gaze that had been making adults uneasy since she was approximately 2 years old, not because it was hostile, but because it was comprehensive. He looked at us like he was surprised, she said. Not regular surprised. The kind of surprise that's also something else. Celine looked at her daughter. Yes, she said. He was. Why? Celine had had 5 years to prepare for this conversation, and she was still not ready for it in the way that you are never ready for the actual version of a thing you have rehearsed. She breathed in once. Because he didn't know about you, she said. Until today. The room was very quiet. Lucian set down the herb bundle. Orion's jaw tightened in a way that was so familiar it hurt. Lyra looked at her mother for a long, still moment and said, with a precision that Celine would think about for years, "Was that your choice or his?" Or, "Both," Celine said, "in different ways. I'll explain all of it to you when you're older. Not because you can't understand it now, but because it's a long story and it deserves more than one night." She looked at all three of them. "What I can tell you right now is that nothing about your life changes because of who walked into this square today. You are mine. This is your home. Everything we've built here is real." Orion looked at her steadily. "But things are going to change anyway," he said. She looked at her son. "Yes," she said. "Probably." He nodded once, processing. Then, "Is he going to come back after he fixes the Empire thing?" Celine opened her mouth, closed it, said, honestly, "I don't know." "Do you want him to?" Lyra again. That flat, precise instrument of a question. Celine was quiet for a moment. "That's the most complicated question I've been asked in 5 years," she said. "And you asked it in about 6 words, which I will not even pretend to be surprised by." She reached out and put a hand on Lyra's shoulder. "I don't have an answer yet. Is that okay?" Lyra considered. "Yes," she said. "Answers should be accurate." She did not go back to the healing hall that night. She put the children to bed. Orion last, because Orion took longest to settle on the nights when there was something large in the air. And then she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of cooled tea and let herself feel the full weight of the day, which she had been managing carefully since the moment Torrance appeared in the hall doorway with the news about riders on the road. It was heavy. She had known it would be heavy. She had constructed herself to bear heavy things. But there is a difference between the weight you have prepared for and the specific, living, three-dimensional reality of that weight when it finally arrives in your actual kitchen and says your name in a voice that your body has been pretending, for 5 years, to have forgotten. What she would not do was mistake weight for weakness. The feeling of impact is not evidence of damage. She was not damaged by the events of today any more than a wall is damaged by the weight it has been built to hold. She made herself be precise about this because precision was her tool. She was moved. That was the accurate word. She was moved in ways she had not expected by the specific shape of his regret, by the word afraid offered without theater, by the exhausted truth of a man who had been running an empire on top of a foundational absence and had finally, apparently, stopped pretending he couldn't feel the gap. That movement was not surrender. It was not the door to the locked room opening. It was information. She would use it accordingly. Cassian was in the barn at dawn, not sleeping. She had known he wouldn't be sleeping because he was the kind of man who processes through action, and the barn was the only place where action was available at 4 in the morning. He was checking his horse's shoes with the methodical attention of a man who needs something to do with his hands, and he looked up when she came in with 2 cups of actual hot tea, because Celine Hart had grown up on the border and understood that practical gestures carry weight that words often don't. He took the cup without comment. They stood in the barn with the smell of horses and hay and the early dark pressing at the gaps in the walls, and for a while neither of them said anything. "Dravon's last intelligence," Cassian said eventually, "says Vivian has sent riders to Greywood." Celine looked at him. "She knows where you went," she said. "She knows I came north. She knows approximately where." He looked into the cup. "She also knows, or will soon know, about the children." The word children in his mouth had a weight to it that it hadn't had the previous evening. Something more personal. Something that had settled overnight from the abstract into the specific. "She'll send someone," Celine said. "Yes." "How long do I have?" 3 days, maybe 4. He looked at her. "You need to move. Not far. You can't take 3 children on a long winter road, but somewhere with more defensible geography than an open market square. Celine set down her cup on a hay bale. You're telling me to run. I'm telling you to be smart about your position. There's a difference. Is there? He looked at her steadily. I know how this sounds, he said. I know what I'm asking. I rode into your life, showed you the disaster my choices made, and now I'm telling you to move your children because my mistakes put a target on them. His jaw set. I know what that is. What is it? She said. It's me doing the same thing to you again. He said it flatly. Putting the Empire's chaos on your doorstep because I didn't manage it well enough. She looked at him for a long moment. The honesty of it hit harder than a justification would have. Yes, she said. It is. She picked up her cup again. But you're also right about the defensible geography. There's a holding on the eastern ridge, old garrison structure, thick walls, good sight lines. I've used it as an overflow facility when the hall was full. We can move there. I'll leave 2 of my guards. Your guards wear Shadowcrest livery. Vivian's riders will spot them before they spot the building. She shook her head. I have people here who know this territory better than anyone you brought with you. Let me handle the protection. Celine, you cannot come charging in and reorganize my defenses, she said. Not angry, just clear. I have been protecting these children for 5 years without your help. I will continue to do that. What I need from you is honest intelligence about what's coming. He was quiet. Then, Vivian won't just send soldiers, she'll send someone she trusts completely. Someone with enough authority to make it look like a legal proceeding rather than an assassination. He paused. She's careful. She's been careful for 5 years. The thing she wants most is deniability. So she'll frame it as a royal matter. Illegitimate claimants to the throne. Unauthorized claimants of noble bloodline. Something like that. Celine understood the architecture of this precisely. The Empire was full of laws designed to manage competing claims on royal bloodlines, and those laws could be weaponized by anyone with enough access and enough desperation, and Vivian Blackmore had spent 5 years accumulating both. Then she'll want to take them, Celine said. Not kill them, take them. Remove them from my custody under some legal framework, put them somewhere she controls, and ensure they never become a political problem, Cassian said. Low, flat. A king understanding the full territory of what his silence had enabled. The moment stretched. Something in his face had gone very still. I'm going back to Shadowcrest, he said. I leave at first light, and when I arrive I will deal with Vivian and the Coalition in the most permanent way the law allows. He looked at her. But I need you to hear one thing. Say it. Those children are mine. He said it with a quietness that had nothing to do with uncertainty. I know I have no standing to say that. I know I gave up every right to say it. But they are mine, and I will not let anything happen to them. Not the Coalition, not Vivian, not the Empire's politics. Nothing. He paused. That is not a negotiation. That is the one thing I am not equivocating on. Celine stood in the early morning barn and looked at the man she had spent 5 years not thinking about and felt the locked room's door move on its hinges. Not open. Move. Then go fix your empire, she said, and come back with clean hands. He nodded once, set down his cup, turned toward the barn door. Cassian, he stopped. Lyra asked me last night if I wanted you to come back, Celine said. I didn't have an answer. He stood very still. I still don't, she said, but I stopped wanting you not to, and for now, that's what I can give you. He walked out into the early dark. She listened to the sound of his horse being saddled, the sound of his guards assembling, the sound of hooves on packed dirt moving south. Then she heard a different sound, a sound that did not belong to the morning, a sound from the road leading east, not south. Riders, multiple, moving fast, not Cassian's men. And then Torrance was in the barn doorway, his face tight, his voice low and controlled. Celine, there are riders coming in from the East Ridge. They're not local. They have Blackmore colors. She looked at him. How many? 12. She turned toward the barn door, toward the direction of the dispensary, toward the building where her 3 children were still sleeping in the last dark before dawn. 12 riders in Blackmore colors arriving from the east, before Cassian had even cleared the southern road, which meant only one thing. Vivian had sent 2 groups, one to follow the king, one to arrive ahead of him. The East Riders were not following Cassian. They had come directly for the children. Celine moved before Torrance finished the sentence. Not the panicked movement of a person who has been surprised. The fast, calibrated movement of a person who has been quietly preparing for something like this since the moment she understood what the Empire's crisis meant for anyone connected to its bloodline, which was 5 years ago, in a barn 11 days north of the border, when she did the arithmetic and understood what she carried and what it would eventually mean for the people who came after her. She had hoped she was wrong about the timeline. She wasn't. "The dispensary," she said. "Back door. Now." Torrance was already moving. He did not waste words on alarm. This was one of the things she valued most about him, that he had the border province quality of converting information directly into action without the intermediate step of emotional performance. He had his coat on and was through the barn door before she cleared the hay bale. The pre-dawn dark was the particular dense black that happens in the 30 minutes before first light, when the night is at its most committed. Celine crossed the distance between the barn and the dispensary at a run, her boots on the frozen ground making a sound she counted as she went. 6 strides, 7, 8, and she was through the back door and up the stairs before the sound of the Eastern riders reached the edge of town. Orion was already sitting up in his bed. Of course he was. "How many?" he said. She did not waste time asking how he knew. 12, from the east. Get your boots." She was already at Lucian's bed, a hand on his shoulder. He came awake cleanly, the way children do who have been raised to treat the word now as a complete instruction. Lyra was already standing, her small feet on the floor, her coat half-buttoned with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided in the first second of waking that being slow was not an option she intended to exercise. They were her children. They were built for exactly this. She had not wanted them to be, but they were. "We're going to the East Ridge," Celine said, keeping her voice at the level of information rather than alarm. "Remember the holding facility? The old garrison with the thick walls and the well? We've been there 3 times. You know the way." "You've been there 3 times, Lyra said. "We've been there twice. The 3rd time you went alone." "Then I'll navigate," Celine said. "Boots, coats, move." They were out the dispensary's back door and into the narrow lane behind it in under 4 minutes, which was a number Celine registered and filed away as insufficient but adequate. The Eastern riders were entering from the main road, which put the dispensary between the children and the incoming threat, which bought approximately 7 minutes depending on how systematically the Blackmore riders searched. 7 minutes was not much. 7 minutes was what she had. She moved the children through the lane at a pace calibrated carefully between fast and dangerously fast. Lyra could keep up with anything. Orion moved like he'd been born running, but Lucian was the smallest, and she would not sacrifice the rearmost child for the speed of the group. She kept one hand back and Lucian's hand in it, and she ran. Torrance was behind them with a lantern shuttered to a thin line of light. He knew this town the way a man knows the space inside his own chest, completely, without having to think about it. He led them through 3 back lanes, across the rear of the mill yard, and out onto the rougher ground behind the eastern settlement boundary, where the terrain began its climb toward the ridge. They were 20 yards past the last building when Celine heard the sound behind them. Not the sound of the Eastern riders in the market square. She had been tracking that, the distant shouts and the horse sounds that indicated men establishing position in a new location. This was a different sound, closer, one rider, moving quietly, which was worse than moving loudly, because a man who is moving quietly in the dark has already chosen the precise version of what he intends to do. She stopped. "Keep moving," she said to Torrance, and her voice was flat and absolute. "Ridge Garrison, take them." "Celine, take them." He looked at her for 1 second, then he took Lucian's hand and moved. She turned around. The rider came out of the shadow between 2 buildings and pulled up 10 feet away, and she recognized him in the thin early dark, not by his face, but by the way he sat a horse. The left shoulder slightly lower, the particular economy of movement of a man who had been trained in the Eastern Cavalry School. She had treated 24 men from that school during the campaigns. She knew their physical vocabulary. She did not know this man's name. He knew hers. "Celine Hart," he said, "by the authority of Queen Vivian Thorne, you are ordered to surrender yourself and the 3 children in your custody for transport to Shadowcrest, where they will be evaluated as to their claimed connection to the royal bloodline." Evaluated. The word was a legal instrument and a threat dressed as a legal instrument, which was the specific kind of language that empires had developed over centuries for the purpose of making violence look like process. The children are in my legal custody, Celine said. I am a registered healer and licensed practitioner of this province with full standing under Silverhaven's governance charter. You have no jurisdictional authority here. The Queen's authority supersedes provincial bars in Yichol. The Queen's authority derives from the King, Celine said, and the King's authority in this province is a matter of treaty, not conquest. Your Queen would know that if she had bothered to read the border agreements rather than simply assume they don't apply to her. She paused. Where's your authorization from the King? The writer's jaw tightened. She had landed on the correct fault line. Because there was no authorization from the King. Cassian had ridden north without telling Vivienne where he was going. That was the specific intelligence gap the coalition had been working around. They knew he had left. They did not know precisely what he had found, and they had moved faster than they'd intended, which meant the legal paperwork was thin. The Queen acts in the King's absence, the writer said. Show me the charter clause, Celine said. I'll wait. He looked at her with the flat expression of a man who has been given an order he believed in until this specific conversation started complicating it. Then he reached for the signal horn at his belt. Celine had already calculated this possibility. She closed the distance between them in 3 strides, grabbed the horn with one hand and his wrist with the other, and twisted with the precise applied leverage that every competent field medic develops from years of moving uncooperative patients. Not violent, not aggressive, just mechanically effective. The horn did not sound. The writer's wrist bent at an angle that caused him to make a sharp involuntary sound and release the horn entirely. She stepped back, held it. Tell your commander, she said steadily, that the children are not here. Tell him whatever else you need to tell him about this conversation. But understand that if you pursue 3 children across frontier terrain in the dark, you will do it without my cooperation and with the full documentation of this exchange available to every governing council in the Northern Territories by sunrise. She turned and walked toward the ridge. He did not follow immediately. The 7 minutes had become 11. It was enough. What? They reached the garrison holding as the first gray light began its cautious entry into the eastern sky. The structure was exactly what it had always been. Old stone, thick walls, a well in the center courtyard, sight lines in 3 directions that had been built by people who understood that the first requirement of a defensive position is information. Celine had chosen it years ago as an overflow facility for exactly these qualities, with the secondary understanding, which she had never articulated to anyone, that overflow facilities and defensive positions shared more DNA than most people like to acknowledge. Torrance had the children inside and the iron bar door secured by the time she crossed the courtyard. Lucian was sitting on a stone bench near the well with his hands between his knees, looking at the ground with the focused internal quality of a child who is processing something large and doing it with more discipline than most adults could manage. Orion was at the east-facing window, watching the approach road with the steady attention of a born sentry. Lyra was standing in the center of the space, looking at Celine when she entered with a gaze that contained a question and had already assembled most of the answer. Was that person going to take us? Lyra said. He was going to try, Celine said. Who sent him? The Queen, the King's wife. The room held that information for a moment. Why? Lucian said without looking up from the ground. Celine sat down on the bench beside him. She was not going to dress this up. He was 5 years old and he was her son, and he deserved accurate information calibrated to what he could carry. Because your existence changes things for her, Celine said. If it becomes known that the king has children, legitimate children, alpha bloodline, her position becomes much less certain. She made choices to protect her position. Those choices included sending people to find you. Lucian was quiet for a moment. So we're a problem, he said. You are a solution, Celine said. To her, that looks like the same thing. He looked up at her. His eyes, not Cassian's eyes, his own, darker and more interior, held something that was not quite sadness and not quite anger, but was somewhere between them in the territory that doesn't have a clean name. Is our father going to come back? He said. The first time any of them had used that word. Father. Celine looked at her son. Yes, she said, because she believed it, and because she did not lie to them, and because the look on Cassian Thorne's face when he said those children are mine had carried a quality she recognized as the specific irreversibility of a man making a decision that he will not walk back. Okay, Lucian said, and returned to looking at the ground. The news arrived with one of Torrance's people at mid-morning, and it was not the news Celine had been expecting, which was the specific quality of news that hits hardest. Cassian had not made it to the southern road. He had been intercepted at the provincial boundary by a second group, not Blackmore riders, but members of his own guard, which was the specific horror of it. 4 men from his personal escort who had been in Vivian's pocket since before they left Shadowcrest. They had taken him south under the pretense of urgency, citing the Chancellor's communication, and it was only when they reached the boundary crossing and he saw the men waiting there, not Imperial soldiers, mercenaries in Blackmore livery, that he understood he had been handed to his wife. Cassian Thorne was a prisoner. His own guard had delivered him. Celine read the message twice, not because the information changed the second time, because the first time she read it, she needed to let the full shape of it land without the management reflex engaging, which was the most honest thing she could do in the privacy of the garrison's stone walls. She needed to feel the actual weight of this before she converted it into a problem with solutions. The weight was significant. Here was what it meant in the clearest possible terms. The Empire's king was in enemy hands. The man who had said those children are mine with the specific irreversibility of a real decision was now in a position where his decisions had no traction. The coalition had moved on 2 fronts simultaneously, riders to Greywood, riders to intercept Cassian, with the coordination of people who had been planning this for longer than one intelligence failure suggested. This was not improvisation. This was architecture. Someone had been building this for years, quietly, in the spaces between the Empire's certainty of its own dominance. There's a specific vulnerability that power creates in the people who hold it. The assumption that because a thing has always been true, it will continue to be true. Cassian Thorne had built an empire that ran on his authority, and the running of it had prevented him from seeing the ways in which that authority was being hollowed out from inside. Every system that concentrates power in a single point creates, as an inevitable byproduct, the people who understand that removing that single point removes everything above it. Vivian had understood this. The coalition had understood this. They had spent 5 years on the patient, structural work of undermining the foundation while the king maintained the edifice above. The betrayal from within his own guard was the detail that changed everything. Because a man can defend against outside threats. He cannot defend against the people he has trusted enough to ride beside him. The guard who turns is the wound that doesn't announce itself until the blood is already on the floor. Celine put the message down. She looked at Torrance. "What do you know about the garrison at Westmark Crossing?" she said. Torrance looked at her with the careful expression of a man who is realizing that the conversation has shifted terrain. "It's a provincial holding facility, used for border disputes mostly. Legal detentions awaiting imperial adjudication." He paused. "It's where they'd take someone they wanted to hold without the optics of a Shadowcrest cell." "It's where they'd take a king they couldn't put in his own dungeon," Celine said. "Yes." She stood, crossed to the window where Orion was still maintaining his watch. "How long to Westmark Crossing on horseback?" she said. 6 hours hard riding, 8 if you want to arrive with a functional horse." Torrance paused. "Celine, you're not thinking—" "I'm thinking very clearly," she said. "That's the problem." She was thinking that the Empire's stability, the stability of the institution that 3 people sleeping fitfully on stone benches in a frontier garrison were about to become part of, whether any of them wanted it or not, depended on the king's freedom. She was thinking that the coalition's plan required Cassian contained, the children contained, and Vivian in control of the succession narrative long enough to make it legal. She was thinking that the gap between contained and permanent was, in the Empire's political tradition, approximately 2 weeks of administrative processing. 2 weeks. She was thinking that she had no army, no official standing, no political authority, and the specific, hard-edged competence of a woman who had survived the northern frontier for 5 years on her own structural integrity. She was thinking that the locked room's door was not just moving on its hinges anymore. She was thinking that the question was no longer whether she opened it. The question was what she picked up when she walked through. She left Torrance with the children and explicit instructions and a list of contact names in the province who could be trusted, and she took the fastest horse from the garrison's small stable and rode south. She rode the way she had walked out of Shadowcrest 5 years ago, with her spine straight and her hands steady, and the specific interior arrangement of a person who has decided that what they are doing is necessary and has therefore suspended the luxury of fear in favor of the more immediate requirement of function. The betrayal had changed the calculus, but it had also clarified it, because here was the thing about a trap, which Celine understood from years of treating people who had been caught in them. The trap's effectiveness depends on the trapped person staying in place. The moment the trapped person moves, not blindly, but with intention toward the trap's weakest point, the trap's geometry changes. A cage that assumes its occupant is passive is not designed for an occupant who is not. Vivienne had designed this trap for the version of Celine Hart who existed 5 years ago. The frightened girl who had stood in the tribunal hall with her hands at her sides and her spine straight and her 2 words, "I'm here," and nothing else. The woman who had accepted exile because she had no structure to resist it with. That version of Celine Hart had disappeared somewhere on the road north. The woman riding south now was built from 5 years of hard material. She was something the Empire had not planned for. She reached the outer boundary of Westmark Crossing as the light turned the particular copper of late afternoon, and she did not approach the garrison directly. She came at it from the western slope, which was the angle that a person would take if they knew the terrain and were specifically trying not to be observed from the main gate, and she tied the horse in a hollow and went the last quarter mile on foot. The garrison was a utilitarian structure. Stone, 2 stories, minimal windows, a wall around the yard that was designed to prevent exit rather than entry. There were 6 guards visible from her position, 2 at the main gate, 2 on the western wall, 2 on the east. The spacing told her the facility was not on full alert, which told her they were confident in the containment. Confident people are not watching for things they don't expect. She watched the patrol rotation for 40 minutes, counted the gaps, built the map of it inside her head with the same precision she used to map a patient's system before surgery, identifying where the flow was interrupted, where the structure was weakest, where a careful intervention could change the outcome without disturbing everything around it. Then she identified something else, a man she recognized, not by name, by the left shoulder, slightly lower, the specific cavalry posture, the same rider who had intercepted her in the lane behind the dispensary in the pre-dawn dark. He was standing just inside the main gate with the bearing of a man who is not a regular garrison guard, but has been assigned to a specific function here. He had ridden ahead, or he had been redirected. Either way, his presence confirmed she was in the right place. She moved around to the garrison's north face, which had the highest wall and therefore the fewest guards, counterintuitive to most people, because the obvious logic is that the hardest approach requires the most protection. But Celine's border province education had taught her that institutions concentrate their visible security where they expect the visible threat, and the north face of a holding facility, with its sheer stone and its lack of obvious handholds, was exactly where a rational attacker was not expected to arrive. She was not a rational attacker. She was a healer who had spent 5 years climbing equipment in field conditions that had no patience for hesitation or physics complaining. She went over the north wall in the last light. He was in the lower holding room. She knew it was him before she saw him because the door was different, heavier, with a secondary bar, the specific security of a room containing something the jailers had been told was more valuable and more dangerous than the average prisoner. She worked the secondary bar with the flat tools she had brought from her medical kit. She would not explain, to anyone who asked, how a healer came to own a tool with that particular functionality, except to say that border province medical work occasionally required entry to structures that were not fully cooperative about being entered. The door opened. Cassian was sitting against the far wall with his knees up and his wrists bound in front of him with the specific imperial cord that was designed to prevent alpha strength breaking, which meant someone had given the binding instruction with particular knowledge of what he was capable of. There was dried blood above his left eye from what had been recently a cut. He looked up when the door opened. He looked at her for a full 3 seconds without speaking. "You came," he said. "Don't make it strange," she said, and crossed the room. She cut the cord with the same flat tool. It had more than one function. And he brought his hands up and worked the circulation back with the methodical focus of a man restoring something he needs to use quickly. She looked at the cut above his eye, pressed 2 fingers to the edge of it. He didn't flinch. "It's not deep," she said. "I know." "Who hit you?" "Reynold, my head guardsman." He said it without inflection. 12 years. 12 years of service. 12 years of proximity. The specific structural intimacy of the relationship between a king and the man responsible for his physical safety. The relationship that, when it breaks something in the architecture of a person's ability to trust the space immediately around them. Cassian Thorne sat in a holding room and said 12 years with the flat voice of a man who has recently understood that the structures he built his security on were not what he thought they were, and was still in the early stage of processing what that means. There's no betrayal that lands like the betrayal of someone you had stopped being careful around. The betrayal of an enemy costs you resources. The betrayal of a trusted person costs you something more foundational than resources. It costs you the map. And a person without a map must build a new one from scratch, with the additional difficulty of knowing that the new map will be built by the same person who failed to accurately map the last one. Cassian sat with that cost. He would sit with it for a long time. "They have people in Greywood," he said. "I know. My children are in the garrison on the East Ridge. They're safe." He looked at her. Something moved in his face that was not quite relief. It was more complicated than relief. Something that contained relief and guilt and the specific weight of a man who understands that his choices put 3 people into a situation requiring the word safe to be applied to them in the first place. "We need to move," Celine said. "The north wall rotation has a 7-minute gap. We have—" She looked at the window's light. Approximately 30 minutes before the late shift changes and the gap closes. He stood. He was steadier than she expected, given the hands, given the head. He had the alpha capacity for rapid physical recovery that she had treated clinically for years. It was not mystical, just metabolic. And he used it now without comment. "My guard," he said. "The ones who didn't turn, Sella, Voss, and the 2 from the outer company. They'll be looking. Where would they go if they lost you?" "Provincial capital, to the governor." He looked at her, which means the governor knows the king is being held at a provincial facility, Celine said, which is the kind of diplomatic incident that requires the governor to act. She looked at him steadily, which is why Vivian needed this to be clean and fast, and why it isn't. A beat of silence. "You turned it," Cassian said. "I moved," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her for a moment with something in his face that she did not examine because there was not time to examine it, and because she had a north wall to climb back over with a king in tow. "We leave now," she said. He moved toward the door. She was right behind him, and they were halfway through it when she heard the sound from the corridor, not the regular footstep of a guard on patrol, but the specific sound of a large number of people moving with coordinated purpose, which was the sound that precedes either a rescue or a very organized termination of the current situation. The door at the end of the corridor opened. 8 men, 4 in Imperial livery, 4 in the Blackmore colors. And in the center of the 8, wearing a traveling coat that did nothing to reduce the precise architectural quality of her bearing, her black hair pinned against the wind with the same deliberate perfection it had maintained 5 years ago in the tribunal gallery. Vivian Thorne. She looked at Celine. She looked at Cassian standing beside Celine. She looked at the cut cord on the floor of the holding room. Her face was composed in the way that a person's face is composed when they have prepared for multiple outcomes and have just identified which one they are inside. "Well," she said. Her voice was exactly as Celine would have constructed it from the available evidence, precise, controlled, carrying the particular register of a woman who has spent a lifetime using that voice as its own kind of weapon. "I see the healer has been busy." She looked at Cassian directly. "I had hoped," she said, "that you would understand what this is, what I'm offering. A clean resolution. The children neutralized before they become a political catastrophe. Your name intact. Your throne intact." She paused. "Instead, you let her walk you out of a holding cell like a man who has forgotten what he is." Cassian said nothing. "She has done this to you," Vivian said. "She walked back into your life after 5 years, and in less than 48 hours, you are standing in a holding facility corridor with cut bonds and a bleeding eye, and you are looking at her like she is the one who knows the way forward." Her voice had not risen. It was, if anything, quieter. "That is not strength. That is a man who has found a wound he cannot stop pressing on." The corridor held that for a moment. Then Cassian said, "Take your men and go back to Shadowcrest, Vivian. Or I will deal with the coalition, the Blackmore contracts, and the 6 months of subversion in my own guard in a courtroom rather than in private. And you will discover that there is a significant difference between a political resolution and a legal one." Her eyes moved to Celine. Something passed through them that was not quite fear and not quite admiration, and was somewhere between them in the specific territory of a person who has just identified the thing they underestimated. "You should have stayed north," she said to Celine. "You shouldn't have sent riders to my children," Celine said. The corridor held the weight of every choice that had preceded this moment. 5 years of them, compressing into this stone passage with its inadequate torchlight and its 8 armed men and its 2 women on opposite sides of a king who was finally, at considerable cost, learning what he should have known at 27. Vivian made a small, precise gesture with her left hand. The four mercenaries moved forward, and Cassian Thorne, in the corridor of a provincial holding facility with dried blood above his eye and no weapons and his hand still raw from the cord, made the choice that he should have made 11 years ago in a hall of 300 people. He moved in front of Celine, not behind her, not beside her, in front. Between her and the men coming down the corridor, his body placed with the absolute finality of a man who has found the one thing he will not negotiate on and has discovered, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, what it feels like to make a choice that belongs entirely to himself. The mercenaries stopped. Nobody in that corridor moved. In the stillness, from somewhere above, from the garrison's upper level, from the direction of the main gate, came the sound of a large number of people arriving with significant urgency, and then voices, and then the specific, carrying authority of a man announcing himself with imperial credentials. The governor's men. Arriving exactly in time to witness a queen's mercenaries facing down a king who was bleeding and unarmed and absolutely immovable. The trap's geometry had changed. But Celine, standing behind Cassian's shoulder in that corridor, understood something that the changed geometry had not yet resolved. The children were still on the ridge. Vivian's riders were still in the north. And the woman in the traveling coat, whose face had just shifted from composed to something more dangerous than composed, was not finished. A cornered strategist does not surrender. She recalculates, and Celine could see, in the flat, assessing stillness of Vivian's eyes, the recalculation happening in real time. The governor's men came through the main gate in a column of 20, and the sound of them in the garrison yard was the sound of a situation changing shape in real time. Boots on stone, the creak of armor, the particular dense authority of organized force arriving with a document and a mandate, and the institutional weight of a provincial government that had just been informed by 3 of the king's loyal guard that the empire's sovereign was being held without authorization on its territory. Vivian heard them. She did not move. This was the specific quality of her that Celine recognized now with a clarity that 5 years of distance had actually sharpened rather than dulled. The absolute refusal to register external pressure in her face or body. A woman who had grown up in the Blackmore house had grown up understanding that the first person to show reaction had already surrendered something, and Vivian had internalized this so completely that her composure was no longer performance. It was structure. It was load-bearing, but structure can be read. And what Celine read, in the 4 seconds between the sound of the governor's men and Vivian's next movement, was this. The recalculation was complete. The public play was over. The legal architecture had collapsed the moment 20 provincial soldiers walked into the yard with imperial credentials and witnessed a queen's mercenaries standing in a corridor with a king they had been holding under false authority. That particular battle was lost before it was fought, and Vivian Blackmore had not survived the Empire's court for 15 years by fighting battles she had already lost. She made the small gesture again with her left hand. This time it was different. Not forward, but sideways, which was a signal, and the 4 mercenaries read it and stepped back, creating a gap in the corridor that was technically a passage and actually an exit strategy. Vivian looked at Cassian. "We will conclude this in Shadowcrest," she said. "In the appropriate forum." She paused. "Under the appropriate laws." She walked out. Her men followed. They were through the garrison's side door and into the yard's shadow before the governor's captain reached the corridor, and Celine watched them go with the specific attentiveness of a person who understands that a retreating opponent and a defeated opponent are entirely different categories. Vivian was not defeated. She was repositioning. The distinction mattered enormously. "Your Majesty." The governor's captain, a solid man in his 40s with the bearing of someone who had spent his career dealing with situations that required him to be both decisive and careful, stopped at the corridor threshold and took in the scene with the systematic scan of a trained officer. King, cut cord on the floor, blood above the eye. Healer. He arrived at an assessment efficiently. "Are you injured?" "Functional," Cassian said. "The Queen, I saw which direction she went." Cassian moved past the captain into the corridor, and his stride had recovered the quality it had in the Greywood Square, the bearing of a man who operates from authority so deep in his system that even a holding cell can't fully strip it out. "Get me a horse and a message to Commander Heth at Shadowcrest. Tell him I'm coming back, and I'm coming back loud." The captain moved. Cassian turned to Celine. In the corridor's torchlight, With the cut above his eye and his hand still marked from the cord, he looked like what he was, a man who had just survived a betrayal that should have ended him, on the strength of a combination of his own will and a woman he had exiled arriving through a north wall with a flat tool and the specific competence of someone who had been building her own survival infrastructure for 5 years without him. He looked at her for a moment. "The children," he said. "East Ridge Garrison. Torrance has them. They're safe." She paused. "But Vivian still has riders in the north. She repositioned here when the garrison play failed. Her riders didn't necessarily get the recall signal." "How many did you say were in Greywood?" 12 came in. I neutralized one conversation, took his horn, but the other 11 are still operating on the original order," Cassian said. He said it with the flat, forward-moving quality of a man converting information into action, and Celine felt the specific and complicated sensation of watching someone she had spent 5 years being angry at demonstrate, in real time, exactly the quality that had made her trust him in the first place. Not the crown, not the authority, but the mind. The way it moved through a crisis without drama, assembling the pieces with the directed efficiency of a person who has decided that feeling things is something to be done after the work is done. She had loved that quality. She had also, she understood now, been failed by it. Because a mind that converts everything into a problem with solutions eventually converts the wrong things, and the cost of that conversion is paid by the people in the problem's radius. He was learning the difference. She could see him learning it. Whether that learning had arrived in time was the question the next 24 hours would answer. So, they rode north in a group of 12. Cassian, Celine, the captain's second-in-command with 8 provincial soldiers, and the 3 loyal guard members who had gone to the governor and triggered the intervention. The road back to Greywood in the dark was not the same road Celine had taken south. They came back faster, with torches, with the organized noise of people who are done with discretion because discretion has been used against them, and it is now time for the different instrument. Celine rode beside Cassian, and they did not talk much, which was not tension. It was the shared silence of 2 people who have a lot to say and understand that the timing of saying it matters. And this was not the time. The road was the time. The work was the time. She was aware of him beside her in the way she had been aware of him in the barn at dawn. That cellular recognition that 5 years of managed distance had not disassembled. It was simply there, the way gravity is simply there. Not dramatic, not optional, a feature of the landscape that required no announcement. She did not examine it. She rode. They heard the trouble before they saw it. A mile south of Greywood, with the first building's lights visible on the low rise ahead, the sound of the night changed. The particular sharpness of a situation that had not held its shape. Voices carrying. The specific report of something structural breaking. And beneath those sounds, one that made Celine's chest compress with a force that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the specific, non-negotiable terror of a parent who hears something wrong in the direction of their children. Fire. Not the dispensary. The east. The ridge. Cassian heard it the same moment she did. Neither of them gave the order to ride faster. They just rode faster. The garrison on the East Ridge was not burning. This was the first thing Celine saw when they crested the approach, and the relief of it was physical. She felt it in her hands, which had been gripping the reins with a pressure she hadn't been fully aware of until it released. The building was intact. The walls were intact. The fire she had heard was smaller. A supply shed attached to the north face, burning with the contained specificity of a deliberate set fire rather than an accident, which meant someone had needed a distraction and had created one, which meant the real problem was inside. Cassian was off his horse before it fully stopped. Celine was a half-second behind him. The garrison door was not barred from the inside, which meant either Torrance had opened it or someone had opened it from outside, and she was running the calculation before they reached the threshold, and then they were through it and into the main hall, and she understood the situation in under 3 seconds of taking it in. Torrance was on the floor against the south wall. Not unconscious, sitting up, one hand pressed to the side of his head, his face set with the specific combination of pain and fury of a man who has been hit and is very angry about it. 2 of the provincial contacts Celine had listed for him were beside him, similarly arranged. 4 of Vivian's riders were in the room. And in the center of the room, with the 4 riders positioned in a loose circle around them, were Orion, Lucian, and Lyra, standing, not against the wall, not crouching. Standing in the center of the circle in the particular configuration they had, Orion forward, Lucian at his left, Lyra at his right, and the three of them had the combined quality of something that the four riders had apparently, in the time since breaching the garrison, found harder to manage than they had anticipated. The lead rider, a heavy-set man with Blackmore colors on his chest and the expression of someone who is 2 hours past the point of patience, had his hand on Orion's shoulder. Orion was looking at that hand with the flat, steady gaze of a child who has decided what he thinks about the situation and is waiting for the situation to present an opportunity. Lyra was watching the door. When they came through, she was already looking at it. Celine saw her daughter's eyes move from the door to her, confirming, then to Cassian, registering, then back to the lead rider with a shift of expression that was the most 5-year-old thing Lyra had done in months. Relief, quickly managed, replaced with something that was working very hard to look like nothing. Cassian took in the room. The four riders had registered his entrance and their hands had moved to weapons, but not drawn. The calculus of 4 men against 12 with Imperial credentials was a calculus that took about half a second to complete, and the conclusion was not favorable to drawing. "Take your hand off my son," Cassian said. The room was completely still. The lead rider looked at Cassian with the expression of a man whose mission has just shifted terrain under him in a way his orders did not fully account for. "Your Majesty," the man started, "we have a— Take your hand off my son." The second time had no additional volume. It had something else, the quality that Celine had only heard from him once before, in the corridor of the holding facility when he had put himself in front of her, the quality of a man speaking from the deepest available register of himself, where there is no room for calculation because the thing being protected is below the level of calculation. The lead rider removed his hand from Orion's shoulder. Orion stepped back half a step and stood. 12 provincial soldiers came through the garrison door. The 4 Blackmore riders made the same calculus the corridor mercenaries had made and arrived at the same conclusion. Plus, it was over in under 10 minutes, the processing of it. The riders remanded to provincial custody. The documentation begun. The message sent south to Shadowcrest's loyal forces with the specific legal language that the governor's captain had been drafting in his head since the holding facility. Torrance was on his feet, refusing assistance with the specific stubbornness of a man who has been a practical person for 50 years and is not going to start accepting help now over a knock to the head, though he permitted Celine to check his pupils with the flat efficiency of a healer who has also known him for 5 years and is not interested in his objections. "You're concussed," she said. "I'm fine," he said. "Those two statements aren't in conflict," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. The children were beside her. Orion had not said anything since the garrison door opened. This was not unusual. Orion processed through silence the way Lucian processed through touch, and Lyra processed through questions. He was standing close enough to Celine that his shoulder was against her arm, which was his version of the same thing. Lucian had his hand in hers. Lyra was watching Cassian. Cassian was standing near the garrison's east window, receiving the captain's briefing on the night's events and the status of the riders in custody, and his attention was on the captain's report. But Celine had spent enough time watching him in the last 48 hours to read the quality of his peripheral awareness, the precise way a person can be conducting one conversation while a different part of their attention is occupied entirely elsewhere. He was aware of where the children were in the room at every moment. He had not approached them. She respected that. It was the right instinct, the understanding that he had no standing yet to close that distance, that the distance was hers to manage and the children's to decide about, and approaching it without invitation would be the wrong kind of force. Lyra, who missed nothing, saw him not approaching. She looked at Celine. "He keeps looking over," she said quietly. "Yes," Celine said. "But he's not coming over." "No," Lyra considered this. "Is that because he thinks he shouldn't?" "Yes." Another consideration. Then, "Is he right?" Celine looked at her daughter for a moment. "For now," she said. Lyra turned and looked at Cassian directly for a count of 3 seconds, the way she looked at things she was assessing. Full attention, no pretense of casualness. Then she looked back at Celine. "Okay," she said, in the tone that meant she had filed the information and would return to it. Done. The decision was made in the garrison's main hall at what the night had become, somewhere past midnight, with the fire in the north shed reduced to embers, and the captured riders in the lower room, and Torrance asleep upright in the corner, because a concussion requires rest, and Celine had told him this 4 times, and on the 4th time he had simply closed his eyes in the middle of the sentence and started breathing heavily. The decision was that they were going back to Shadowcrest, not because Selene had decided it was safe. It was not safe. The Empire's capital had Vivienne's coalition partially intact, Cassian's guard partially compromised, and a political situation that was, in the governor's captain's measured assessment, not yet resolved. Not yet resolved. The decision was that going back was the only move that addressed the problem at its source. Vivienne had revealed the full reach of her play. Riders north, king contained, children targeted, and the reveal had occurred before the play completed, which meant she was now operating on damaged ground. But damaged ground is not neutral ground. A person with resources and desperation and the specific institutional knowledge of someone who has spent 5 years in the Empire's court will continue to find angles until the source of the contest is resolved. The source was Shadowcrest. The source was the throne. The source was the question of what the Empire was, and who it belonged to, and what bloodline stood at its center. Selene had spent 5 years building a life on the frontier precisely to avoid being subject to those questions. And now the questions had followed her home, breached her garrison, put riders' hands on her son's shoulder in the dark, and made themselves impossible to continue avoiding. Here was what she understood, sitting in the East Garrison with her 3 children asleep against her in the early hours before dawn. You cannot outrun the thing that is attached to you. You can exile yourself from an empire. You can build walls of practical competence and frontier distance and 5 years of deliberate reinvention. But if what you carry in your blood and in your children's blood, and in the specific, unresolvable fact of a bond that was made before anyone asked you whether you wanted it, if that thing has a consequence in the world, the consequence will find you. The garrison walls don't stop it. The northern border doesn't stop it. The only thing that resolves a foundational conflict is going to the foundation. She looked at Cassian across the garrison hall. He was watching her watch him. "The children come with us," she said. He had not asked. He had been waiting. "Yes," he said, "on my terms, under my authority. If at any point I decide Shadowcrest is not safe for them, we leave. No argument." "Agreed. And this, whatever this is between you and me, that is a separate conversation that happens after the Empire's house is in order, not before." He looked at her steadily. "Agreed. I'm not going back because I forgive you," she said. The room deserved the accuracy. "I'm going back because the problem that was created 5 years ago cannot be managed from a frontier garrison, and because 3 children are sleeping against my side and they deserve a world that isn't permanently organized around their mother running from it." Cassian was quiet for a moment. "I know the difference," he said. "Good," she said. "Then let's be ready to move at dawn." Well, they reached Shadowcrest 4 days later. 4 days on the road with 12 provincial soldiers, 3 children, a king, and a healer was not a comfortable journey by any measure, and the discomfort was not mitigated by the political tension that rode alongside them like an additional traveler. The knowledge that Vivienne had departed Westmark Crossing before them and had 4 days to reach Shadowcrest and prepare whatever she intended to prepare. 4 days was significant. 4 days was enough to call in debts, realign loyalties, build a case. Selene had spent the journey in the particular productive mode of a person who is moving toward a confrontation and using the time to prepare for every version of it. She had talked to the loyal guard members. She had read the governor's documentation on the coalition's activities. She had watched Cassian operate in the field, the way he managed the column, the decisions he made at each stop, the specific way he talked to the men, and the way the men responded to it. And she had updated her understanding of him with the new information the way she always updated her understanding of anything, with precision and without sentiment. He was a good commander in the field. She had always known that. The Empire's military record was real. What she had not seen before, because the circumstances had not required it, was the quality he exhibited on the 3rd evening of the road, when Lucian fell sick with the particular swift violence of the respiratory infections that moved through road camps in cold weather. It wasn't serious. Selene assessed it within 10 minutes and had the treatment protocol clear in her head and the necessary materials in her kit. But it was fast, and it was uncomfortable, and Lucian, who was the quietest of the 3 and the one who processed difficulty most internally, sat with a fever and his mother's hand on his forehead, and looked for the first time in the journey genuinely small and genuinely miserable. Cassian had been at the other end of the camp when it happened. He was beside them in under 4 minutes. He did not ask what to do. He watched Selene work for a moment, reading the treatment correctly, and then he sat on the ground. A king, on the ground, in a camp, without apparent awareness of the absurdity of it. and talk to Lucian with the quiet, even steadiness of a man who is learning, in real time, that he has an entirely separate capacity from the one he has been using his whole life, and is discovering it works. He talked about the road, about the horses, about the specific bird he had seen that morning whose call was doing something unusual for the season. Lucian listened. His breathing evened. His fever, which would have come down on the treatment's timeline regardless, seemed to take the conversation's tone as additional instruction. Celine watched Cassian with her son. She felt the locked room's door move again. She let it move. She did not fight it. She also did not open it. Later, when Lucian was sleeping and Cassian had returned to the other end of the camp with the guard, Orion appeared beside her in the way he had of moving without announcement. "He stayed a long time," Orion said. "He did." Orion was quiet. "Is that what fathers do?" he said. Not plaintive, not angry, just the question of a child constructing a category from available evidence. "Some of them," Celine said. Orion processed this. "Okay," he said. Same word, same catalog quality. Filed for later. Shadowcrest Citadel rose on the horizon on the morning of the fourth day, like an argument that has been waiting patiently for you to arrive. The black spires. The walls that had been built to intimidate and had succeeded for 4 centuries. The particular weight of a place that is simultaneously a home and an institution. A building and a statement, a structure and a claim about the nature of power. Celine looked at it from the road and felt nothing she had not already felt about it, which was the specific benefit of having had 5 years to process her feelings about Shadowcrest in the complete absence of Shadowcrest's actual presence. She had grieved it, been angry at it, understood it, contextualized it. What remained was not comfortable, but it was workable. She could be in this place without being undone by it, which was the only threshold that mattered. She was aware of Lyra beside her on the road, looking at the citadel with those comprehensive eyes. "It's very big," Lyra said. "Yes. Bigger than Silverhaven's capital. 3 times bigger." Lyra considered this. "Do people get lost in it?" "Sometimes. There are people whose entire job is to know where other people are." "That seems inefficient," Lyra said. "One good map would solve most of it." Celine looked at her daughter. "You're probably right," she said. They rode through the citadel gates as mid-morning turned the black stone to dark amber, and the soldiers on the walls watched them come in, and Celine kept her spine straight and her hands easy on the reins, and the 3 children rode with the particular quality they had consistently demonstrated on this road. Alert, observant, managing their own interior states with a discipline that their mother recognized because she had built it in them deliberately. They were ready for this. She was not certain she was. She rode in anyway. Look, Commander Heth met them in the outer yard. He was a compact man in his 50s with the build of someone who had spent 40 years doing the work personally rather than delegating it, and he had the expression of a man who has been managing a crisis with insufficient information for 4 days and is very glad to see the information arrive. "Majesty." He gripped Cassian's arm at the elbow. Not a bow, the grip of a military equal confirming physical presence after an absence that had been concerning. "You look terrible." "I look functional," Cassian said. "Those are not the same thing." Heth's eyes moved to Celine, to the children. He was a man who processed information in sequence, and he processed this information with visible effort and then settled it into a category and moved forward, which was exactly the response the situation required. "There's a problem." "There are several," Cassian said. "The largest one first." Heth kept his voice low. "Vivian arrived yesterday. She has called an emergency session of the Noble Council. It convenes this afternoon. She's framing it as a regency question. She's arguing that the king's absence during a succession crisis constitutes grounds for the council to assume temporary governing authority. Under the old charter, Article 9, she has a claim. She's trying to have the council formalize her authority before I can contest it," Cassian said. "She's trying to have it formalized before she announced publicly," Heth said, and looked again at the children, "that there are alternate claimants, because once that's public, her regency claim dissolves." He paused. "She needs the council's formal authority in hand before we can present the children," Cassian said. Heth nodded. "How much time?" Celine said. "The session convenes at the second afternoon bell." Heth looked at the sun. 4 hours. 4 hours. 4 hours between a queen who had spent 5 years building a position and the public acknowledgement of 3 children whose existence dismantled it. Celine looked at Cassian. Then we need to be in that hall, she said. Yes, he said. All of us. He looked at her steadily. All of us. The next 3 hours inside Shadowcrest moved with the specific compressed quality of time under pressure. Each moment carrying the weight of 10 regular moments, the decisions made in quick succession, each one a link in a chain that would either hold or break under the weight of the afternoon. Cassian met with Heth and the loyal commanders. Celine put the children in the care of 2 of Heth's most trusted soldiers in rooms that she personally inspected for exits and sightlines before she left them, with explicit and detailed instructions about what would happen if those exits were used without her authorization. The soldiers looked at her with the expression of people who have received very clear instructions from someone who means them, and confirmed they understood. She then spent 40 minutes in the Citadel's legal archive with the governor's captain and Shadowcrest's own legal authority, an elderly man named Piran who moved slowly and thought with the speed of someone who has been doing this for 50 years and has most of the relevant law indexed in his head, working through the documentation of what existed, what could be established quickly, and what the council session would require in terms of evidence. The Alpha bloodline verification, Piran said, moving through the documentation with his dry, precise hands, is not a complicated process. For children carrying the bloodline at the level these children appear to carry it, the verification is almost immediate. It's not the verification that will be contested. It will be the legitimacy of the bond. The bond was formally renounced, Celine said, at a tribunal proceeding. Yes, Piran looked at her over his document. By the king. The renunciation was a royal instrument. It can be reversed by a royal instrument. He paused. If the king chooses to reverse it. She looked at the old legal authority. Has that happened before? She said. Once. In the 3rd century, under King Avar II. There was significant political fallout. He paused. The resulting dynasty lasted 200 years. She went back to Cassian. He was finishing his military briefing. She waited until the commanders cleared the room. Then she sat across from him at the strategy table with the direct, unceremonious efficiency that was how she addressed the things that mattered. Piran says the bond renunciation can be reversed, she said, by your authority. Today, before the council session, it reframes the children's status completely. It also, she paused, keeping her voice accurate. It makes a significant claim about us that I have not agreed to. He looked at her. I know, he said. I'm not saying no, she said. I'm saying that if you do this, you do it because it's legally necessary for the children's protection, not because of what it means about us. Those are 2 separate things, and I need them kept separate. And if I tell you that they're not entirely separate for me, he said. She was quiet. Then I tell you that I hear that, she said finally, and that it is a conversation for after the council session, not before. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he stood and went to find Piran. The council hall at Shadowcrest was built on the same architectural philosophy as the Grand Tribunal, the design of a space intended to communicate to anyone standing in its center that they are surrounded by the weight of institutional authority, that the institution has been here longer than they have and will continue after them, and that the individual's relationship to it is essentially one of temporary passage. Celine had stood in a version of this hall before. She walked into this one differently, not alone, not with her hands at her sides in the managed stillness of someone who is working very hard not to show fear. She walked in with 3 children, Orion at her left, Lyra at her right, Lucian between Lyra and the edge of the formation, and 4 soldiers behind them, and Commander Heth to her right, and the understanding in her body of every decision that had brought her to this specific floor in this specific hall on this specific afternoon. The noble council was assembled, 31 lords, their advisors, the military cabinet, Vivian, seated at the secondary chair to the right of the throne, the consort's chair, in the deep violet silk that was apparently her armor of choice, with her black hair arranged and her bearing composed, and her eyes tracking to the door the moment it opened. She saw Celine. She saw the children. Something happened in her face that was the most human moment Celine had ever witnessed from her. Not the composure, not the calculation, but the brief, unmanaged fracture of a woman who has just watched the central assumption of her strategy walk in the door on 2 small feet, multiplied by 3. It lasted less than a second. Then the composure returned. But Celine had seen it. The throne door opened and Cassian walked in, and the room did what rooms of this kind do when the king enters. It rearranged itself. attention converging, the authority physics of the space shifting around his presence. He wore the crown. He had, in the last 4 hours, recovered the cut above his eye with the specific efficiency of someone who does not have time to nurse wounds and has decided they will address the wound later and the work now. He walked to the throne. He did not sit. He stood in front of it, which was a deliberate choice, standing rather than sitting, using height and presence rather than the formal authority of the seated position, which communicated something specific about the nature of what he was about to do. "My lords," he said, "I understand there is a session called." Lord Edrin, heavy-set, silver-haired, the senior member of the coalition, rose from his seat with the performance of a man who has prepared this moment. "Your Majesty, under Article 9 of the—" "I've read Article 9, Cassian said. "Perron walked me through it an hour ago. It applies to an absent king. I'm present." He paused. Session concluded. "The Queen has called this session under—" "The Queen," Cassian said, and his voice was still controlled, still the flat authority of the managed man. But there was something underneath it that was not the managed man. "Does not have the authority to call a noble session. That authority belongs to the throne. The throne is me. The session is concluded." He looked at Vivian. She looked back at him. The room was completely still. "What I do have authority to call," Cassian said, and he turned to face the council as a whole, "is a formal announcement, which I am making now before this assembled body as a matter of record." He turned. "Celine Hart, bring the children forward." Celine moved. She walked the three of them to the center of the hall. Same floor. Different woman. Different everything. Cassian looked at the council. 5 years ago, he said, I made a choice in this hall that was politically defensible, legally sanctioned, and personally wrong. I renounced a bond that was real, and I exiled a woman who was innocent of anything except existing in a category my council found inconvenient. He paused. The consequences of that choice are standing in this hall right now. He looked at Orion, at Lucian, at Lyra. "These are my children," he said. "Orion, Lucian, Lyra, Alpha bloodline, verified by Perron under the legal standards of this empire. They are my heirs." Another pause. "They are legitimate." The room erupted. Not chaos, the directed noise of 31 lords and their advisors processing a political realignment of significant magnitude. The overlapping voices of people recalculating positions in real time, and above it all, the sharp carrying voice of Lord Edrin making an objection about the renunciation, and 3 other voices following, and the gavel coming down, and "The bond renunciation," Cassian said, and his voice cut through the room with the specific quality of a man who has decided he is done being careful about volume, is hereby reversed by my authority, effective now. He looked at Celine. "If she'll have it." The room went quiet. He was looking at her. In front of 31 lords and their advisors and the military cabinet and the consort's chair and the 500 years of institutional architecture of Shadowcrest Citadel, looking at her, not with the king's face, with the other one, the underneath one, older and less managed. She had told him this was a separate conversation. He had answered her. She looked back at him for a long moment with 3 children beside her, and 5 years between them and the full weight of every accurate thing she had ever said about what he had cost her. Then she looked at Vivian. Vivian was watching her with the specific fixed attention of a woman who has understood that the outcome of the next 10 seconds determines the shape of the rest of her life. And Celine looked at the consort's chair and at the council, and at the institutional weight of a hall designed to make individuals feel like temporary passage. And she felt very clearly the specific difference between the version of herself who had stood in a hall like this 11 years ago, with her hands at her sides and her spine straight, and her 2 words, and nothing else, and what she was now. She looked at Cassian. "We have a great deal to resolve," she said. Her voice was even and clear and carried the full length of the hall. "Between us, between you and those children, between this empire and its history of treating people as problems to be managed." She paused. "None of that resolves itself by a declaration in a council hall." The room was very still. "But yes," she said, "I'll have it." Something broke open in Cassian's face, not dramatically, not with the theatrical release of someone who has been waiting for a cue. The quiet, almost private breaking open of a man who has been holding a very specific weight for a very long time and has just been given, by the one person whose opinion on the matter he entirely defers to, permission to set it down. And then, before the room could exhale, before the council could reorganize, before anything could resolve into the next moment, Vivian moved, not slowly, not with the composure. She moved with the speed of a woman who has understood that every legal avenue has closed, that the political architecture she spent 5 years building has collapsed in a single afternoon, that the only thing remaining between her and a permanent loss of everything is a single, final action that cannot be called back. She was not moving toward the throne. She was moving toward the children. She had something in her hand. Celine saw it the same moment Cassian did. The room fractured into simultaneous motion. Guards, lords, the military cabinet, bodies moving in the instinctive converging response of people in a room when danger reveals itself. And in the center of all of it, 3 children who had been standing with their mother in the most formal hall in the empire, and who now faced the specific reality that the woman crossing the floor toward them had made a calculation. And the calculation was that if the bloodline could not be controlled, it would be removed. Orion did not move back. He stood. Cassian crossed the hall. Not at a run, at the particular speed of a man who has made a decision about where his body goes and is executing it with total commitment, every other calculation set aside. The crown and the politics and the 5 years of wrong choices compressed into this one movement toward the 3 people he had spent this entire journey learning were the one thing he would not negotiate on. He reached them. He put himself in front of them, between Vivian and his children, for the second time in 48 hours, with no weapons and no hesitation, and every scar and every wrong choice, and every year of being afraid of choosing something that was only his, all of it behind him, and all 3 of them behind him, and Celine's hand finding his arm in the chaos. The guards reached Vivian. She stopped. She looked at Cassian over the guard's shoulders with the flat, assessing eyes of a woman who has just understood, finally and completely, that she has lost, not the session, not the argument, but the foundational contest, the one that determines what kind of person a person turns out to be when the pressure is sufficient to reveal them. She had revealed herself. So had he. The hall was chaos and still and everything at once. And Celine stood behind Cassian's shoulder with her hand on his arm and her children pressed against her back, and the full, unmanageable reality of this moment bearing down from every direction. Lyra's voice came from just behind her, clear, completely steady. The voice of a 5-year-old who has assessed a situation with her specific, comprehensive attention and arrived at the most accurate sentence available. "Is it over now?" Lyra said. Celine looked at the guards restraining Vivian, at the council frozen in their seats, at the 31 lords and their advisors who were watching a dynasty reconfigure itself in real time, at Cassian standing in front of his children with his back straight and his hands empty and something in his bearing that was not the king's quality and not the underneath quality, but a third thing, something new, something that looked like a man who has finally found the correct version of himself and is standing in it for the first time. She looked at her daughter. "Almost," she said. The guards held Vivian. She did not struggle. That was the specific quality of her in this moment. The composure returned like water finding its level. The body settling into stillness the way it does when a person has passed through the last available action and arrived at the territory where only bearing remains. She stood in the grip of 2 of Heth's men with the item she had drawn still in her hand, a small blade, ceremonial in origin, the kind carried by the Blackmore family's women as a tradition so old it had stopped being understood as a weapon and had therefore been permitted in the council hall with no one questioning it. And she looked at Cassian with the particular flat steadiness of a woman who has decided she will not perform defeat. Heth stepped forward. He took the blade from her hand with the precise, impersonal efficiency of a man removing a tool from a situation. She let him. The hall was still moving in the way that large spaces move after danger passes through them. The noise of 31 lords settling back into their seats, the exhale of bodies that had been rigid with uncertainty, the low voices of advisors leaning toward their principles, the institutional machinery of the empire's governing apparatus recalibrating around what it had just witnessed. Cassian stood in front of his children and watched Vivian be disarmed. Then he turned. The 3 of them were pressed against Celine with the specific close arrangement of children who have been frightened and are managing it, which meant they were standing straight and not making sounds about it. and were pressed close enough that Celine could feel each of them against her as three distinct and irreplaceable weights. Orion was looking at the blade in Heth's hand. Lucian had his eyes closed and was breathing with the slow, deliberate rhythm that he used when he was sorting something large. Lyra was looking at Vivienne, not with fear, with the comprehensive, assessing gaze of a child who is cataloging every detail of a person's behavior because she has determined that understanding this person is more useful than being frightened of them. Cassian looked at his daughter. He had been looking at her for 4 days on the road, and he was not, Celine could see, any closer to being finished being overwhelmed by the specific fact of her. By all three of them. By what it meant that they existed and that he was only now standing close enough to read the quality of how Lyra looked at the world. He crouched down. A king in the council hall of Shadowcrest Citadel, in front of 31 lords and the full military cabinet and a disarmed queen, crouched down to be at eye level with a 5-year-old girl. "Are you all right?" he said. To Lyra first, then moving to Lucian, then Orion. Quiet. Direct. The question of a man who needs a specific answer. Lyra considered the question with her characteristic thoroughness. "Yes," she said. "She wasn't fast enough." Cassian looked at his daughter for a moment. "No," he said. "She wasn't." Orion uncrossed his arms. "You got there before her," he said. The flat observation of a child who has filed a significant data point. "Yes," Cassian said. Orion looked at him with Cassian's own eyes from a child's height, and said, with the careful precision of someone asking the question they actually mean, rather than the one they have been told is appropriate, "Would you always?" The hall was close to silent. Cassian held his son's gaze. "Yes," he said. The word carried nothing extra. No performance, no qualification, no machinery of authority underneath it. Just the word, and the man who said it, and the complete absence of any distance between them. Orion looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Filed. The formal proceedings took 3 hours. Celine sat through them in the council hall's secondary seat. Not the consort's chair, which she had not been asked to occupy and would not have occupied yet regardless, with Lucian asleep against her side because the road and the week had accumulated past his 5-year-old capacity to manage entirely awake, and Orion and Lyra on either side of him with the attentive stillness of children who understood, in their bones, that what was happening in this room was about them and about a great deal more than them simultaneously. Vivienne was removed to the holding rooms within the first 20 minutes, not with cruelty, with the specific procedural efficiency of an institution that has handled its own in crisis before. Perron accompanied the removal with documentation. Lord Edron attempted to speak on her behalf, and Cassian permitted it for exactly as long as was legally required, and then said, with the even precision of a man who has stopped being interested in performance, that the legal documentation would speak for itself, and the council's opinion on the matter would be welcomed in the formal hearing that would be convened in 30 days. 30 days? Not now. Not in the heat of it. In 30 days, with proper procedure, with documentation, with the institutional machinery of the Empire operating at its design speed, rather than the accelerated speed of crisis. This was, Celine recognized, a decision that required restraint. The easiest thing, the thing that the anger and the betrayal and the knife in the council hall would have made entirely justifiable, would have been immediate action, permanent action, the kind that ends a problem with finality. Cassian chose the slower thing, the harder thing, the thing that required him to manage his own response and trust the process he was responsible for building. It was, she thought, the first time she had seen him choose the slower thing. She did not say anything about it. She noted it. Lord Edron and Lord Sutter and Mace were informed that their involvement in the Coalition's activities would be the subject of the same formal hearing. They received this information with the varying expressions of men who had gambled on an outcome and were processing the loss in different ways. Edron with contained fury, Sutter with the deflated quality of a man who had never fully believed the plan would work and had gone along anyway. Mace with something closer to relief, as if the specific weight of what he had been participating in had been heavier than he had admitted to himself. 3 of the border commanders were identified and their status addressed through Heth, who had been managing their files for a week and was prepared. The loyal guard members who had ridden north and triggered the governor's intervention were formally commended. Reynold, the guard who had delivered Cassian to Vivienne's men, was not in Shadowcrest. He had apparently understood the direction of events and made a decision about geography sometime in the previous 24 hours. The decision was noted. The documentation was begun. Heth expressed the view, in the dry, precise language of a military man, that geography would not prove a permanent solution for Renaud. Cassian moved through all of this with the specific quality that Celine had been observing for 4 days and updating her understanding of the combination of mind and will that had always been real, operating now in the service of something that had not always been real. The will that had previously been in service of the Empire as an abstraction, as a 400-year legacy to maintain, was now in service of something more specific. Something with 3 names and 3 distinct ways of looking at the world. This did not make him perfect. It made him better than he had been. The distinction mattered. The children fell entirely asleep before the formal proceedings concluded. All 3 of them, arranged against Celine in the council chair, with the specific boneless quality of children who have held themselves together through more than their years, were designed to carry and have finally reached a space where the holding is no longer required. Lucien had been the first, then Orion, then Lyra, fighting it longest, as was her nature, but eventually surrendering to it with the pragmatic acceptance of a child who has decided sleep is simply the logical conclusion of the available data. When the council session formally concluded, Celine did not move immediately. She sat with all 3 of them and felt the weight of the day pressing down through the top of her head and settling somewhere in her chest, and she let it settle. She was not going to manage this moment. There was no productive function that management served here. This was the kind of moment that required simple presence, the willingness to be inside it without converting it into a problem to solve. She was in Shadowcrest, with her children, with the man she had spent 5 years being exiled from. The room was nearly empty now. Lords departed, advisors following, Heth at the door with 2 soldiers, giving her the specific privacy of a man who understands when a room needs to be smaller. Cassian came and sat beside her, not in the throne, not in any formal chair. He sat on the floor beside the secondary seat, with his back against the chair's side and his legs stretched in front of him, and he looked at the 3 sleeping children with the expression of a man who is looking at something he did not earn and is going to spend a long time being honest about that. They sat in silence for a while. Good silence, the kind that doesn't require filling. Then Cassian said quietly, "I don't know how to do this." She looked down at him. "Do what specifically?" she said. "Any of it." He was looking at Lucian's sleeping face. "Be their father. Be whatever I'm supposed to be now. I know how to run an empire. I know how to command a battlefield. I know how to manage a council of 31 men who all want different things." He paused. "I don't know how to sit on a floor next to 3 children who have spent 5 years not knowing I exist and earn something from them." "You don't earn it all at once," Celine said. "I know that. And you don't earn it by trying to earn it. You earn it by being present consistently over time and letting them decide what it means." She paused. "Orion already filed something. You saw his face after you answered him." "Filed it," Cassian said. "Not resolved it. No, filed it. For later review." She looked at her son's sleeping face. "That's how he works. He's going to watch you for a long time. He's going to test the consistency of you, not by designing tests, but by just watching whether the thing you said today is still the thing you do in 6 months." She paused. "Be consistent. That's the entire instruction." Cassian was quiet. "And Lyra," he said. "Lyra already knows," Celine said. "She's been watching you since the square in Greywood. She has a working theory. She'll update it as data comes in." A pause. "She'll tell you when she's decided something. When she does, listen carefully because she'll say it once and the precision will be higher than you expect from a 5-year-old. And Lucien," Celine looked at her youngest, at the dark interior eyes closed in sleep, at the small hands loose against the fabric of his coat. "Lucien," she said, and her voice was quieter, "is the one who will need the most time. He processes inward. He's been carrying the father question longer than the other 2 in his own way. He won't ask it directly. He'll ask it through proximity. He'll start sitting close to you when you're doing something the way he sat close to Torrance for 2 years before he told Torrance he trusted him." She paused. "Don't push. Don't create opportunities. Just be in the room and let him find his way to the edge of you at his own pace." Cassian looked at his son. "Okay," he said. Quiet. The word of a man receiving real information and intending to use it. Then, And you. The question had its own weight, not pressuring, not claiming, the question of a man who understands he has asked for a great deal already and is asking one more thing. Celine was quiet for a moment. Here was what was true. The locked room was open. She had not opened it dramatically, not in the council hall, not in the holding facility corridor, not anywhere with an audience or a gesture. It had opened the way real things open, incrementally, in barn conversations at dawn and road camps at night, and a crouching king at eye level with his daughter in front of 31 lords. Here was what else was true. An open door is not the same as a resolved reckoning. The room was open, and there was a great deal in it that required examination. The grief she had managed rather than finished, the specific injury of the tribunal hall that had never fully closed, the 5 years of doing everything alone that had been necessary and had also cost something, the accumulated weight of being both parents to 3 children because the other parent had been absent and the absence had been chosen. These things were real. They were also not insurmountable. She understood the difference now between what cannot be undone and what cannot be recovered from. The first category is real and must be named and sat with. The second category is, in most cases, smaller than it feels from inside the wound. "I'm here," she said. "That's what I can tell you tonight. I'm here. I said yes in the council hall. I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him. "The rest of it we build slowly, without shortcuts, without the crown or the politics deciding the timeline." She paused. "If that's enough for now." He looked at her. "It's more than I had yesterday," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." Vivian Thorne's formal hearing convened on the 31st day. Celine attended. She attended because she had been present for the events that constituted the case's foundation, because her testimony was part of the legal record, and because she had decided in the quiet of the 30 days between the council session and the hearing that she would not look away from the proceeding the way she had looked away from none of the difficult things she had been required to face in the last 5 years. The hearing was long, 3 days. Perron presided with the meticulous patience of a man who has been doing this for 50 years and understands that the speed of the proceeding is one of the things that gives it legitimacy. Every document, every witness, every piece of the coalition's architecture laid out with the specific, methodical honesty of a process that has decided to see itself clearly. Vivian said very little during the 3 days. When she did speak, in the formal statement she was permitted on the final day, she spoke with the same composure she had maintained throughout, the surface of her perfectly managed, and said that she had acted in the Empire's interest as she understood it, and that she understood the Council's judgment would be what it would be. She did not apologize. Celine had not expected her to. The judgment was exile. Permanent. The Blackmore titles were suspended pending review of the family's involvement in the coalition's financing. Lords Edran and Mace received formal censure and a 2-year suspension of council participation. Lord Sutter's cooperation with the investigation was noted, and his sentence was proportionally lighter. Renaud was found 2 weeks later in a fishing village on the eastern coast. His case was handled by Heth. The Empire did not execute people for political betrayal under Cassian's governance. This was a policy change he had made quietly and explicitly in the first week after the council session, after a conversation with Celine that she had not initiated and had not needed to because he had come to her with the question already formed. She had said what she thought. He had made the policy. The relationship between those two events was one they both understood without narrating it. Exile and institutional removal. Permanent, real, without cruelty. It was not a satisfying outcome in the way that finality is sometimes satisfying. It was a correct one, which is a different category. Vivienne left Shadowcrest on the morning of the 35th day in a carriage with her personal attendants and the clothes she had arrived in. Celine was not at the gate when she left. She was in the Citadel's eastern gardens with Lucian, who had discovered in the previous 2 weeks that the gardens contained a specific variety of late autumn plant that, when dried and prepared correctly, had properties he wanted to understand, and who had been approaching this project with the serious, tactile focus that was entirely his own. She heard the carriage wheels on the stone. She stayed in the garden. There was nothing she needed to witness. The departure was a fact. Facts do not require attendance. What happened in the months after was not dramatic. This was one of the things Celine had not fully prepared for, the specific texture of the aftermath, which was not triumphant or cinematic, but was instead the ordinary, continuous, demanding work of building something real out of materials that had been forged in a crisis and now needed to function in the regular world. Cassian learned to be a father the way he had apparently learned to be a king, by paying close attention, being willing to be wrong, and not letting the wrongness stop him from continuing. He was not natural at it. Natural was not the point. Consistent was the point. And consistent was something he had, it turned out, the full capacity for. Orion watched him for 6 weeks before he made the shift that Selene had predicted. The specific relaxation in his bearing when Cassian came into a room, the replacement of assessment with assumption, the beginning of taking Cassian's presence for granted in the way that children take for granted the presence of people they have decided are reliably there. On the 43rd day, Orion appeared at the door of Cassian's study while Cassian was working, sat down on the floor beside the desk without asking, and opened the reference text he had been carrying, and read it in silence for 2 hours. He did not ask permission. He did not explain himself. He simply decided the room was available to him and used it. Cassian did not comment on it. He continued working. He was aware, Selene could see it when she passed the study door and looked in, that something significant had just been extended to him without ceremony, and he was meeting it without ceremony, which was exactly the right response. Lyra updated her working theory on the 21st day and delivered the update to Cassian directly at the dinner table with the flat precision Selene had predicted. "You make decisions faster than most people," she said, looking at him across the table. "But you think longer before them than it looks like." Cassian set down his fork. He looked at his daughter with full attention. "Yes," he said. "That's why the council is slower than you want it to be," Lyra said, "because they see the fast decisions and think you're not thinking, but you already thought." A pause. "Yes," he said again. "You should tell them that," Lyra said, explicitly. "People perform better when they understand the process." She returned to her food. "That's just information management." Cassian looked at Selene across the table. She looked back at him with an expression that communicated several things and said none of them. He turned back to his dinner. "Thank you," he said to Lyra. "That's useful." Lyra accepted this as the correct response and moved on. Lucian took longer. 48 days. The careful peripheral approach that Selene had described, the gradual reduction of distance, the specific test of consistency that was not a design test but was rigorous regardless. On the 48th day, Lucian appeared at Cassian's side during the afternoon when the horses were being exercised in the outer yard. Cassian had made a habit of being there for this, which was something Lucian had observed for 2 weeks without participating, and stood beside him at the fence rail and watched the horses without speaking for almost 20 minutes. Then he said, looking at the horses, "The gray one favors the left front." Cassian looked at the gray horse. "You're right," he said. "It's not bad yet," Lucian said, "but it will be if it's not addressed." "I'll tell the stable master." A pause. "I can tell him," Lucian said. "I know what to look for." Cassian looked at his son. "All right," he said, not making it large, not turning it into something, just receiving it in the size it had been offered. Lucian went and told the stable master. He came back to the fence. He stood beside Cassian until the exercise was finished. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. Selene and Cassian's reckoning happened on the 61st day, not by plan, by arrival. The way certain conversations arrive when the conditions are finally right, when the material has been sitting long enough to be ready, when both people are in the same space at the same moment with nothing else that requires immediate management. It was late. The Citadel was quiet. She had been in the Eastern study reviewing medical resource allocations for the Northern territories. She had, in the 60 days since arriving in Shadowcrest, taken a formal role with the Empire's medical governance, because the work needed doing, and she was the person most qualified to do it, and because it gave her something real and useful that was entirely hers within this structure, which was a requirement she had not been willing to compromise on. Cassian found her there and sat down in the chair across from the work table and said, "Can we talk?" "Yes," she said. "Not about the children," he said. "Not about the Empire. About us." She set down the document. "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands the way he had looked at them in the barn on the dawn of the second day. The posture of a man preparing to say something true. "I have spent 60 days," he said, "trying to find the right way to say what I need to say to you. and I've concluded that the right way doesn't exist, which means I should stop looking for it and say the true version. Say the true version, she said. He looked up at her. I knew, he said. In the tribunal hall. I knew it was wrong before I did it, not the political calculation. That was real, and the pressure was real, and the argument my counsel made was not without logic. But underneath all of it, I knew. I could feel the knowing the entire time I was speaking, and I did it anyway. He paused. Not because I was afraid, although I was afraid. Not because the Empire required it, although the Empire did require it. I did it because I decided that what I felt was less important than what I was supposed to be, and I had been making that decision for so long that it didn't feel like a decision anymore. It felt like a fact. Celine looked at him. And now, she said, and now I understand that it was the worst decision I have ever made, he said. Not because of the political consequences, not because of the succession crisis, because of you, because of what I cost you, because of 3 children who grew up without a father, because I decided my discomfort with choosing something for myself was a reason to exile a woman who had done nothing wrong. He exhaled. That is what I did. I want to say it plainly and not dress it in political context or personal history or the things my father built in me. I chose badly. The cost was yours, and I cannot give those 5 years back. The room held that. Celine sat with it for a moment. Here was what she understood about forgiveness, which was not the same thing as what is commonly said about it. Forgiveness is not a gift given to the person who wronged you. It is a structural decision made by the wronged person about whether they intend to continue carrying the weight of the wrong as an active burden. It is not exoneration. It is not the erasure of what happened. It is the decision to put the weight down, not to throw it away, because the weight is real and putting it down does not make it not have existed, but to stop carrying it in a position where it interferes with forward movement. She had been doing the work of this for 60 days. She had been doing preparatory work for 5 years. I know you can't give them back, she said. I'm not asking for them. I'm asking for what comes next to be built differently. Built on honesty, which means when something is wrong, you say it's wrong, rather than managing it. And when you're afraid, you name it rather than converting it into a policy decision. And when I tell you something costs me something, you hear it the first time. She looked at him steadily. That's what I'm asking. Yes, he said. And you understand that I may not always be quick with this, she said. That there are going to be moments where the distance comes back because the distance was a tool I built for surviving your absence. And tools that have served you well are not instantly retired just because the circumstances change. I'm going to need you to be patient with those moments rather than interpreting them as evidence that we aren't moving forward. Yes, he said again. She looked at him for a long moment. A man who had learned, at significant cost, the difference between managing a person and being honest with them. A man who was sitting across from her with no performance and no machinery and no crown, just the actual person, the one who had been underneath the king for the whole duration, emerging now into a situation that required him to be only that. She reached across the table, put her hand on his. It was not a grand gesture. It was not reunion or resolution in the sweeping sense. It was something quieter and more durable than those things. The specific, deliberate act of a woman who has decided, with full knowledge of the cost and the history and the work that remains, that the person across from her is worth the continuing. He turned his hand over. They sat in the late-night quiet of the Eastern study, with her hand in his, and the document on the table between them, and the 60 days of careful, unglamorous construction behind them, and the rest of it still ahead. It was enough. More than enough. It was the beginning of the actual thing, which is always less dramatic and more durable than the crisis that precedes it. Quan. In the spring of the following year, Shadowcrest Citadel opened its gates for a formal ceremony. Celine had been involved in the planning of it to the degree she had chosen, which was specifically and only the elements that required her expertise. The medical provisions for the gathered crowds, the coordination with the Northern Province governors, the careful briefing of the children on what would be required of them and what would not be required, and what they could absolutely refuse if it became too much. Lyra had reviewed the ceremony schedule and made 2 structural recommendations that Perron incorporated into the final plan because they were correct. Orion had asked 3 specific questions about the legal significance of each element of the ceremony and had been satisfied by the answers. Lucian had not asked questions. He had sat beside Celine during the briefing with his quiet, inward attention and had at the end said simply, "Okay," which was the word all three of them had inherited from their mother, and which carried in his mouth the specific quality of a person who has integrated the information and is ready. On the morning of the ceremony, before the Citadel's outer gates opened to the assembled population of Shadowcrest and the delegations from every territory in the Empire, Cassian found Celine in the Eastern Garden. Her garden now, in the way that spaces become a person's spaces after enough mornings in them. He stood at the garden's edge. She looked at him. He was wearing the crown and the formal state coat, and the expression of a man who has done the specific hard work of earning the right to wear them without the weight of unresolved wrongness underneath. "Ready," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. They walked through the gate together. The three children were ahead of them, Orion already walking with the bearing that was going to make his eventual role in this empire entirely self-evident to everyone who observed it. Lyra managing the path with the organized awareness of someone who is processing the crowd and the geometry simultaneously, Lucian between them with his quiet presence and the specific steadiness of a person who has decided in his own time and by his own method that this is where he belongs. The crowd was large. The crowd was loud. The crowd was the accumulated weight of an empire that had been through a crisis and had come out the other side into something that had not yet proven itself but that had demonstrated, in the person of its king and the woman standing beside him, the willingness to choose the difficult, honest thing over the easy, manageable thing. That is not a small demonstration. It is, in the long record of what empires do and fail to do, a rare one. A kingdom is not built by the moments when everything works. It is built in the spaces between those moments, in the choosing and the failing, and the honest reckoning with the failure and the choosing again with better information. A ruler who has never been wrong is a ruler who has never been tested. A ruler who has been wrong and survived the wrong and come back to it with open eyes is something more difficult and more valuable. A ruler who knows the weight of the decisions they make because they have paid the weight personally. Cassian Thorne had paid it. He was paying it still, in the daily, unglamorous, entirely necessary work of being present and consistent and honest with three children who were watching everything and a woman who required nothing less than the complete version. He was paying it willingly. This is the distinction that matters, not the crown, not the 400 years, not the armies or the black spires or the empire that stretches from the northern frontier to the eastern sea. The willingness to pay the cost of what you are, fully and without negotiation, is the only measure of a person that outlasts the circumstances that tested it. Celine walked beside him in the spring light with the sound of the crowd and the warmth of the season and the specific, exact weight of everything it had taken to arrive at this particular morning, and she felt it all. Not managed, not converted, not filed for later. Present. This was what she had built. Not a kingdom, not a dynasty. A life that belonged entirely to her and to the people she had chosen to share it with. It was, in the final measure, exactly enough. On the golden balcony of Shadowcrest Citadel, before the gathered thousands of the Empire's people, the royal family stood. Orion looked out at the crowd with the steady, cataloging attention of a future commander. Lyra looked out with the assessing intelligence of a future diplomat. Lucian stood between them and looked out with the quiet interior depth of someone who understands things that take other people considerably longer to understand. Celine stood beside Cassian in the spring light. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at her children. Three people who had been forged in the hardest conditions she had survived, who carried in them everything she had learned and everything she had refused to give up, and the specific, irreplaceable fact of who they were without anyone's permission. They were the proof. Not of love, though love was part of it. Not of the bond, though the bond was real. The proof of what remains when you strip away the performance and the politics and the institutional weight and the 400 years of dynasty. When you strip all of it away and stand in a barn at 3 a.m. and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. What remains is what you are willing to carry. And what you carry long enough becomes, in the end, what carries you. The empire stretched to the horizon in every direction. The morning held everything it had always held and was, for the first time, entirely honest about it. Celine Hart looked at her three children and felt the weight settle. Not press, not burden, but settle. The way a foundation settles when the building above it is finally complete. And she breathed in the spring air and let herself be here, fully, without management. Present in the life she had built from the ground up, with her hands, in the dark, alone, and then not alone, and then here. Here. The gates were open. The kingdom's future looked brighter than its past, and for the first time in 5 years, Celine Hart was not walking away from anything. She was home,